I call the Minister to move the first Ways and Means motion in respect of the Finance No. 2 Bill. Minister to move.
Formally.
Has he got to speak at all? No, Kirsty Blackman. The question is as on the order paper. Kirsty Blackman.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I just want to draw attention to the House the unusual circumstances that there are in moving a Ways and Means resolution after the Finance Bill. What we had during the course of the budget was a discussion on the founding resolutions that had been laid at that point. Those founding resolutions do not include an amendment of the law resolution, which historically was sensible practice, which Labour previously complained about the Conservatives removing, which the Conservative Chancellor at the time said was simply an administrative change. In fact, removing the amendment of the law resolution from the resolutions means that the government has to now put down new founding resolutions because otherwise it can't make the tax changes that it's looking to make. It also means that no member in this House can move anything that is outside of the scope of those resolutions. It restricts any member debating things in the course of the taxation measures that we would like to debate, if they may sit outside those founding resolutions. We've had the progress of this bill. The committee stage was held in this House initially. Then it moved to Bill Committee. I previously raised significant concerns about the fact that the Finance Bill does not take oral evidence at any stage in its movement through the House. It doesn't take oral evidence here because it's already had part of the committee stage in the main chamber, despite the fact that the stuff that we do in Bill Committee is usually the more technical pieces, which would very much benefit from having oral evidence sessions, and it wouldn't hold up the progress of the Finance Bill very much. In fact, we've had a significant length of downtime with this Finance Bill. There's been periods of time that oral evidence sessions could have been taken. So we end up in a situation where that scrutiny happens. We look at all of the things that are included within the bill. We come to report stage after the line-by-line scrutiny has occurred, and then the government is adding new founding resolutions in order that it can add new parts to this Finance Bill. In terms of the way that scrutiny is done in this place, Madam Deputy Speaker, I've got significant concerns about the progress of this, about the reasons that it's being done this way. I would like to ask the government, particularly, if they will commit to ensuring that either they will not do this again, because I don't think it's a good way to ensure transparency and scrutiny of legislation, or if they would commit to putting an amendment of the law resolution in as the final resolution, as historically was normal practice, and would allow the government to make the changes it needs to make today without having to have new Ways and Means resolutions. And if the Minister is concerned about this course of action, he might want to note that there are 45 minutes for each of these Ways and Means resolutions, and in future iterations of the Finance Bill, it would be entirely possible for members to stand up and talk for 45 minutes on these Ways and Means resolutions. So adding new Ways and Means resolutions means that members have got additional time to talk about those specific things, which would reduce the scrutiny and the important things that the Minister, I'm sure, wishes to talk about when we come on to the main part of the Finance Bill. So if the Minister could commit to having a look at the way that this was done, to trying to ensure that we're not again in the situation where Ways and Means resolutions are being added at the very last stage of a bill's progress, or, as I say, to include that amendment of the law resolution which would allow them the flexibility to do this, then I think that would be very helpful and certainly would dissuade me from talking for 45 minutes on a Ways and Means resolution in the next iteration of the Finance Bill.
Minister Tomlinson. Minister Tomlinson.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I thank the honourable member for her remarks and her scrutiny of the process that's followed here. I appreciate it from wherever it comes. She is right to flag that this is not the typical process, and I will endeavour to make sure that in future finance bills, if I'm in my position, that Ways and Means motions are not brought at this late stage. She's right to point out to Madam Chair that this debate, well, I don't believe there are any other bobbers, but the subsequent debate could in fact go on for 45 minutes. And of course, discussions may ensue on that topic. I will be happy to look at this and look at the process. I would say, though, on this specific point, this is a technical amendment which allows some regulations that need to be introduced as part of the abolition of the lifetime allowance to have a retrospective effect back to the point that the lifetime allowance was originally abolished. This ensures that the changes that we're making do operate as they were intended to do so. So this is a small and technical measure, though I do take the point that it does mean that this adds a new part to the bill and in fact means a new resolution has been brought forward. I do hope that members will understand that position, notwithstanding the valid points raised by the member opposite, and I do therefore commend this resolution to the House.
The question is, as on the order paper, as many as are of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. I now call on the Minister to move the second Ways and Means motion in respect of the Finance No. 2 Bill. Minister to move.
Formally.
The question is, as on the order paper. The question is, as on the order paper, as many as are of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
Finance Bill, as amended in Committee and Public Bill Committee, to be considered.
Now.
We will begin with Government New Clause 5, with which it will be convenient to consider other selected new clauses and amendments as listed on the selection paper. I call the Minister to move Government New Clause 5.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'm glad to return to the Commons to debate the Finance Bill at report stage. I'm glad too, though I'm sure it will have been an interest to members on all sides that we haven't had two sets of 45-minute debates on the resolutions just discussed, but the opportunity was there. I must say I'm glad that members didn't take it in full. We now have ample time for this important report stage. I want to thank members on all sides of the House for their contributions during the committee stage, with particular thanks to the Shadow Exchequer Secretary for his scrutiny and challenge during that stage and for his invites to his wonderful constituency. I hope one day to take them up. Other members of the opposition front bench have not yet invited me with such enticing prospects to their constituency. I look forward to those invites. Before I turn to individual amendments, I do wish to briefly reflect on the budget that was delivered back in November, Madam Chair, by my right honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer. That budget took the fair and necessary decisions to deliver on the government's promise of change, decisions to support cuts in the cost of living, decisions to enable NHS waiting lists to continue to fall, and decisions to make sure that our national debt fell as a share of GDP and that borrowing falls over the course of this Parliament. As the Chancellor was saying in this place both yesterday and on Monday, government borrowing, public sector net borrowing has fallen from 5.2 to 4.3% of GDP, a 1 percentage point fall. That's very significant. And it means that our borrowing is coming down as part of our plan to bring stability back to the public finances. I would, of course, be very happy to give way to the Honourable.
Would the Minister acknowledge that debt reduction is only taking place because the government has increased taxes in this country by £66 billion, and that contrasts with the rise of taxes of £7 billion that was promised in the Labour Party manifesto? Could he explain why the huge discrepancy between the promise in the manifesto and what this government is imposing on our constituents?
Minister.
I would ask the member to consider whether or not his party wishes to identify £66 billion of expenditure cuts or wishes to borrow £66 billion more. I don't think that either option is what the British public want. I think the British public want us to see bringing down borrowing, getting public finances under control after they were span out of control by Liz Truss and the previous government. And they do understand the need for increases in taxation in a fair and a responsible way to make sure that we can invest in our public services and in the future of our country again.
I thank the Minister for giving way. And on the point of the raised taxation, would he agree with me that the decisions that this Labour government have made has meant an increased spending on the NHS? A number of my constituents in Harlow are self-employed and actually not those in really long waits in A&E and in hospital for operations having a huge impact on their business and therefore their household finances.
I would strongly agree with my honourable friend and I thank him for his representations again and his ability to mention Harlow in his interventions. It's a fantastic part of the country, not too far from my constituency in North London, and I know just how strongly he seeks to represent it and to make sure that the public services in his patch, the local hospitals and schools, get the investment that they need. And that's why he and I are able to proudly support the decisions that this government has made to bring the public finances back into good order, as well as to invest in our public services and to get borrowing down. Of course, though, since the budget, and particularly in recent days, the world is changing again. And as the Chancellor set out last week in responding to the Office for Budget Responsibility's spring forecast, it is more important than ever that the government continues to deliver on its economic plan. The choices that we have made at previous budgets will fix long-standing issues in the taxation system, will restore economic and fiscal stability and lay the economic foundations that we need for higher growth and higher living standards across our fantastic country. This finance bill legislates to deliver on these choices, all while sticking to our commitment not to raise the main rates of income tax, employee national insurance contributions or VAT. We're also providing stability for businesses by keeping to important commitments in our corporate tax roadmap, keeping our corporation tax rate at 25%, the lowest in the G7, rather than having it chop and change up and down like it did in previous administrations. I also want to thank all those who have submitted written evidence throughout the bill's passage and following concerns raised by professional bodies, concerns that were discussed in Bill Committee too. I would like to take this opportunity to reiterate my reassurances to the sector that measures which directly impact tax advisors are intended to create a fairer tax advice market. I've heard concerns that tax advisors might be penalised if they file a client's tax return late when their client has not provided their approval for filing the return on time. And I want to take this opportunity to clarify for the House that these powers are not designated to penalise responsible tax advisors who act in good faith, and that in the specific scenario, a tax advisor would not be penalised under HMRC's stronger powers. The Government is committed to ensuring that the tax system works effectively for everyone, which is why, at report stage, the Government is introducing a number of amendments to ensure that the tax system is working effectively and as intended. I'll now turn to the first group of Government amendments. Turning first to new Clause 5, which removes specific provisions which could prevent offshore income gains from being designated under the Temporary Repatriation Facility, or TRF, to ensure that they can be designated as intended. The amendments also simplify the existing treatment of offshore non-reporting funds held by offshore structures for all taxpayers. New Clause 6 introduces transitional provisions for offshore income gains arising before the 6th of April 2025. Following the abolition of the lifetime allowance, new Clause 7, as we were just discussing, ensures that there are not multiple different regimes applying, providing clarity for pension schemes and members. New Clause 7 ensures that any necessary regulations can have a retrospective effect back to the 6th of April 2024, clarifies the scope of the original power, extends the power by a further 3 months, and ensures regulations are subject to the affirmative parliamentary procedure. Madam Chair, at report stage, the Government is also making a number of further amendments. These are minor and technical in nature. These help provide greater clarity and address important points that have been raised by stakeholders, particularly during the passage of this bill. They simply put the original legislative intent beyond doubt. These include Amendments 12 and 13, which ensure Clause 23 will only apply to general earnings that are for the tax year 26/7 and subsequent tax years, which are paid on or after the 6th of April 2026. Amendment 14 tightens the existing provisions under Clause 24 to ensure that those rules do not catch legitimate agency structures. Amendments 48 and 51 remove legislation that is not necessary under Clause 43 and ensures the TRF legislation works as intended, so that beneficiaries from overseas trusts are able to make designations in connection with offshore income gains. Amendments 49, 50 and 52 are consequential amendments to Schedule 3 and Clause 43, which remove references to omitted legislation and insert wording to clarify a reference to the Taxation of Chargeable Gains Act 1992. Amendment 53 to Clause 49 makes clear that a person concluding contracts on behalf of a non-resident company must be present in the UK when concluding those contracts in order to create a permanent establishment in the UK. Amendments 56 to 61 to Schedule 11 concern the rules preventing fund managers from circumventing the revised carried interest tax regime. These amendments ensure that the provision operates as intended, where two connected persons work in the same business, with each connected person only taxed on their own carried interest. Yes, I'd happily give way.
Madam Deputy Speaker, it sounds as if the Minister is adding many, many pages extra to our tax code. Could he tell us what provisions he will be bringing forward to shorten and simplify the tax code?
Minister.
He does raise an important point, and we do need to do all we can to make sure we are simplifying our tax code to make it easier for tax advisors, for individuals and for businesses. I have also asked the question, because there are some changes that are being made with amendments. I'm reassured by my officials, and I'm sure the Honourable Member could consult Hansard too, that this is a sort of typical number of amendments to be made for a finance bill, though I do take the point, and he may or others may wish to make it, this is a long finance bill, but there are a whole range of important changes that the government wishes to introduce and make progress on. I'm sure members on all sides have enjoyed poring over the changes to the tax legislation. But I do take the point about simplification. It's something that I wish to focus on. If members have good ideas in that space, they would genuinely be very welcome to write to me. I would happily give way.
I thank the Minister for giving way. In terms of simplifying our tax system, one of the things that I don't see in the government amendments are changes that were proposed by us during committee stage to the loan charge system, where you've had people who have already settled their loan charge being excluded from the changes being produced. Does he not agree, though, that one of the consequences of this might mean when something like this comes up in the future, people won't want to settle with the government because they think that a better deal will be coming up? Would it not be a simpler tax system to say that we could retrospectively apply some of these changes?
Minister.
I thank the Honourable Member for his intervention and for his engagement on Bill Committee. The issue of the loan charge is a really important issue. It's one that I focused on after receipt of Ray McCann's independent review into the loan charge, which was commissioned by my predecessor. The scope of that review and the decisions made by the government are such that only those who are directly affected by the loan charge will have the opportunity to take up the new settlement that was recommended by McCann, which the government has added a £5,000 further deduction to. It was the government's position that it is right, because the loan charge was an exceptional decision made by the previous government, that the changes proposed by McCann would only apply to that group. There will be those who engaged in use of disguised remuneration schemes from before 2010, and with them and with all taxpayers, this government's very clear that individuals do have a responsibility to pay their tax. Amendments 54, 55 and 62 to 66 are minor amendments to the definitions of business property qualifying for relief. These ensure that the replacement property provisions relating to reorganisation or amalgamation of unquoted shares reflect the new legislation, and that unquoted securities such as loan notes continue to qualify for relief only where they are part of a controlling interest in a company. Amendments 15 to 47 to clauses 63 to 67 make a series of minor technical changes to ensure that the provisions on inheritance tax on pensions operate as intended. These ensure excluded and exempt benefits are not subject to inheritance tax, nor to the new withholding and payment notices. Madam Chair, I'm sure members on all sides have enjoyed that run-through these minor and technical amendments. I can provide you with the good news that that run-through is now concluded. I do sincerely hope and expect that the proposed amendments will ensure that the legislation that was set out, that has been discussed and scrutinised, works as intended, and that HMRC, the organisation which I'm proud to be the Minister with responsibility for, have the powers to responsibly collect tax and revenue which fund the vital public services that our country relies on. I therefore commend new clauses 5, 6 and 7 and Government Amendments 12 to 66 to the House, and I look forward to contributions from members in the coming minutes.
Offshore income gains.
The question is that new clause 5 be read a second time. Shadow Minister.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and we're grateful to the Minister for running through the plethora of government amendments which have been added to this already stonkingly large finance bill. And I think the sheer number of amendments is an admission that ministers didn't get this right first time or even second time in the committee stage proceedings which we enjoyed. But I'll now turn to the amendments 1 to 8 and 67 to 94, as well as new clause 10 in my name and that of my honourable friends. And this finance bill embodies Labour's approach of ever higher taxes, higher spending and higher borrowing, and it's hard-working families and businesses that are paying the price. The measures in this budget and this bill add a further £26 billion worth of tax rises, bringing the cumulative total from the Chancellor's first two budgets to £66 billion, which, as my humble friend pointed out, did not feature anywhere in the manifesto. And that's despite the Chancellor promising not to come back for more. Debt interest is forecast to hit £140 billion by 2030. Unemployment is set to increase to 1.9 million. Youth unemployment has risen to 16.1%. And meanwhile, welfare spending is set to hit £406 billion. And living standards are expected to slow towards the end of this Parliament. And growth. Last week, the ABR downgraded its growth forecast once again. And they warned that the Chancellor's plan, far from working, could constrain economic activity. And instead of backing the risk-takers and the wealth creators, this finance bill delivers slower growth, higher borrowing and higher taxes. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, let me turn first to the freeze in income tax thresholds set out in clause 10. The Chancellor stood at that dispatch box and said there would be no extension of the freeze on income tax thresholds, because it would hurt working people and take more money out of their pay slips. That promise has been broken by the measures in the bill that do exactly the opposite, putting in place a £23 billion a year tax rise, bringing nearly 1 million more people into paying higher rate tax. And of course, it's not just working people who will pay the price of this. During this period, the state pension is forecast to be higher than the personal allowance, and in the spring forecast, the OBR warned that an additional 1 million pensioners will find themselves liable for income tax by 2030-31 because of this freeze, the Chancellor's freeze. That is, in anyone's book, a retirement tax. And now the government has promised to protect people who rely solely on the state pension, but whereas the detail, there's nothing in this legislation to do that, and people, the public out there, will rightly be sceptical given the broken promises the Chancellor has already made, saying she wouldn't freeze this threshold to do so. So Amendment 5 offers the House a very simple choice: to stand by working people and by pensioners and to end the freeze. I turn now to the government's damaging family farm and family business tax. And I know honourable members opposite are going around their constituency saying they got a great win from the Chancellor just before Christmas. But let's be honest, that was purely a fig leaf. The government could have taken the opportunity to actually correct their mistake, but the partial reversal the Chancellor was forced into falls short. The Country Land and Business Association has said that this only limits the damage, yet another broken promise from a Prime Minister who pledged not to impose inheritance tax on farms. And it epitomises Labour's apparent hostility towards family farms, tenant farmers and our rural communities. And I've spoken to farmers, I'm sure other honourable members have, who are desperate about this situation. And that's why we continue to strongly oppose this family farm and family business tax, and Amendment 6 would scrap them. Our further amendments seek to mitigate its worst effects. Amendments 67 to 87 would remove the transition period on changes to the release and delay implementation until after March 2027, lifting the unfair anti-forestalling rules that have tied the hands of farmers and business owners. And the Chartered Institute of Taxation, who provide a lot of support, which I'm grateful for during the committee in earlier stages, have warned that these measures particularly affect older farmers, robbing them of the ability to plan properly. Amendment 88, Madam Deputy Speaker, would defer the deadline for inheritance tax instalments by a further 12 months. This reflects the House of Lords Economic Affairs Committee conclusion that the 6-month deadline proposed for the first payment does not appear to be realistic. Farming estates and family businesses are often, as we know, asset-rich but cash-poor, making it difficult to raise the funds quickly. The NFU has warned that expecting probate to be granted within 6 months is completely unrealistic, especially given the complexity of valuing an agricultural business. Does the Minister recognise the strain that such unrealistic deadlines place on family farms and family businesses? And will he therefore accept our amendment and extend the payment deadline to 12 months? And if he won't do that, will he explain to the farming and family businesses why not? Amendments 89 to 94 would exclude for inheritance tax the value of any jointly held tenancy on the death of a joint tenant. This is causing concern across the sector and has been raised by the Tenant Farmers Association and by my honourable friend at the, who sits on the front bench. Exempting genuine arm's-length tenancies between unconnected parties from inheritance tax is simply the fair thing to do. And again, I'd be grateful to the Minister to explain what engagement he's had with the Tenant Farmers Association on this point and what his response is and how he intends to rectify the injustice. Of course, this is not just about farms. Family businesses are firmly in the Chancellor's crosshairs as well. They make up 90% of our firms and employ well over half the workforce. These are firms that focus on the long term. Yet, according to Family Businesses UK, over half of affected businesses have already paused or cancelled investment as a result of this threatened tax. And of course, it would be remiss not to mention that the government's claims don't seem to add up. Will it actually end up raising money? While the OBR forecasts a £500 million gain, the CBI analysis suggests a net loss of nearly £2 billion once the wider damage to the economy is considered. So the family farm and family business tax does nothing to promote growth or fairness. It targets those who anchor our rural economy and communities, the family businesses committed to long-term growth. It's already having a chilling effect on investment. Now the prospect is a breakup of companies that otherwise would thrive under family stewardship. So again, I urge honourable members to support Amendment 6, which would remove this damaging measure. And savers and investors are not safe from the Chancellor either. Amendments 1 to 4 cover the introduction of increases in income tax on dividends, on savings and on property income in the years ahead. Increases to the dividend tax will hit 4 million people by 2029-30. The savings tax rate increase will hit a further 3.8 million individuals. And now 2.4 million landlords will face higher bills, making it less attractive to provide the rental properties our constituents want. These measures are targeted at the entrepreneurs, the investors, the pensioners and hard-working families. And rather than supporting growth, the government seems determined to stifle it. Madam Deputy Speaker, the government is also scrapping the long-standing inheritance tax exemption for pensions. 10,500 estates will be targeted under this measure, costing savers £1.5 billion by 2029. We oppose this extension of inheritance tax, which seems predicated on the government's belief that people's money belongs to the government rather than being their own. We should be rewarding saving and people who do the right thing, and extending inheritance tax in this way does exactly the opposite. There's also concern, as we discussed previously, around the burden being placed on personal representatives, and I raise the unintended consequences for unmarried couples, where in some cases a surviving partner could lose up to 40% of a pension fund built up over a lifetime. Again, this is manifestly unfair, and Amendment 7 would remove this damaging new tax from the bill. Happily give way.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. I wonder if he notices a common thread through the budget, which is that everyone that works hard, who saves hard, who invests, who creates jobs, is being penalised, and all this money is being used to benefit Benefit Street. So it's no wonder that the growth rate is going down.
My honourable friend is absolutely right, despite the chuntering we hear from the Minister. The welfare bill is forecast to rise to £406 billion over the forecast period. The Chancellor keeps saying she's fixing welfare. Where? What is she doing? She had to back away from very modest savings. We've identified £23 billion worth of welfare savings, and the honourable member could follow those if he wished to, but he doesn't. And that's why growth has once again been downgraded. And the Chancellor boasts about beating the forecast last year. Well, the forecast at the beginning of the year was 2%, and the government failed to get anywhere near 2%. They beat the downgraded forecast. So let's not hear more about that. We want to hear what the government's actually going to do to drive growth, and taxing the people generating it is precisely the wrong thing to do. And finally, I turn to new clause 10, requiring the Chancellor to review the UK carbon border adjustment mechanism. And we had a lot of debate on this in the committee, and a great swathe of the bill in schedules is set out on CBAM, but there's plenty more to come. And given the complexity of this policy, many industries believe the absence of a formal oversight process and review process in the bill is a serious misstep and needs to be addressed. And there are many potential pitfalls in this new mechanism. Firstly, the measure fails to consider several sectors at significant risk of carbon leakage, such as chemicals and refining. Secondly, the government has decided to link UK emissions trading to the EU trading scheme. And since the announcement of that alignment, the price of carbon in the UK more than doubled, costing our economy around £5 billion if those prices had held steady. We should be reducing the burden of carbon taxes on business, not increasing them. And the EU has yet to publish its benchmark beyond 2030, meaning the UK would be signing up, effectively giving Brussels a blank cheque. And CBAM does not address issues with carbon leakage in export markets either. And there are proposals to exempt our manufacturing exports from UK ETS costs and CBAM to make the industry more competitive, putting it on a level playing field internationally. Has the Minister considered maintaining long-term free allowances for products destined for the export markets? So given those complexities, and I could go on about more, but the Minister gets the gist, and I think he should recognise the. I think other honourable members may want to come in on this issue. I think the Minister should recognise the value of regular reviews. And I know he'll say that the government keeps all taxes under review, but let's have an actual review that then is published so we can actually see what's happening. And therefore, I encourage honourable members to support new clause 10. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is a finance bill full of tax increases that break trust with the British people. The Labour government has introduced the family, farm and business tax, frozen personal thresholds, hiked taxes on savers and investors, cut relief on employee ownership trusts, taxed inheritance pensions, taxed taxis, as we discussed in committee, and increased gambling, alcohol and other duties and environmental levies. The list goes on and on. There's 534 pages worth, which I could read out if there was appetite for that. So our amendments would back the taxpayers and investors and the businesses trying to drive growth in our economy, and I urge honourable members to support them.
Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I rise to support this piece of legislation, and in particular to move new clause 4. Madam Deputy Speaker, I have to admit, I'm a terrible person to go shopping with. I grew up in a household, wait for it, I grew up in a household where my dad used to stockpile copies of Which. As a family, it was drilled into me that you had to seek advice. You could never just buy things. Pity my poor partner at the time we went to try and buy a sofa. It was a very long, drawn-out day. I was taught the value of information and advice in making good choices in life. I'm not claiming to have always followed it, but particularly because it is easy to rip people off, to mislead them, and that there are people who will exploit misinformation to cause harm to others for their own financial gain. It's very difficult for individual consumers to fight that, but collectively, with good regulation, we can make an economy work well. New Clause 4 is about good advice and the power it has to empower consumers to make good choices. I welcome clauses 156 and 157 of this bill and the work that the government is doing to crack down on those organisations who promote harmful tax avoidance schemes. We've all seen them. We've seen the companies who promote schemes to avoid paying tax, often to the elites. One can only think of Jimmy Carr and what must he be thinking at this point in time. The banning of promotion of tax avoidance schemes that have no realistic prospect of working is the right thing to do because it is causing harm. But I am not here to play a violin for the elites. I am here to bang the drum for the millions of people who are also being harmed by that principle, but as yet haven't had the same level of attention. There might be elite companies doing this for an elite group of people, but out there, online, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of accounts now doing this for the masses and causing financial detriment and harm to our constituents as a result. And I would argue this is a much greater harm because these are people with too much month at the end of their money. So when they realise the mistake they've made and the monies that they've lost, they do not have the savings to be able to pay the bill. We know we are living through a prolonged cost of living crisis where every penny spent and every penny saved matters to our constituents. Frankly, representing one of the poorest communities in this country, I know that my community knows exactly how much cash they do not have. So they know that every bill makes a difference. Over 4 million people in this country are now behind on their council tax. Bills have risen by an average of 54% in the last 10 years. The Money Advice Trust tell us and around 7 million adults are now behind on at least one household bill. That's why good advice matters for financial planning, because people are desperate for advice about how to deal with that situation. And that's where these con artists come in. Because a survey released earlier this year found that 14% of the public, around 7 million people, are now following financial advice from online personalities, or what people call finfluencers. Among adults aged 18 to 24, that rises to nearly 1 in 3. And what is the consequence of this? Well, research from Barclays found last year that over half of those who have acted on the financial advice they found online have lost money as a result. These are people in every one of our constituencies. This is an issue that affects the entire nation, making life-altering decisions based on wrong, often deliberately wrong advice, and sometimes tragically, dangerously wrong advice. Because the key problem here is that finfluencers all too often are not driven by a desire to be helpful. They're driven by the perverse incentive that the number of clicks and likes they receive drives the money that they gain from this behaviour. So the more outlandish the claim they make, the more money that they will make. And in the context of tax and the amendment New Clause 4 before you, this can have catastrophic personal consequences. I believe very strongly that governments should do all they can to help tackle personal debt. I also recognise, frankly, the call that our tax system is too complicated and that what these people are doing is preying on the complexity of our tax system. So I welcome the fact that the Minister is up for the challenge about how to simplify our tax system. But for many people who are paying their taxes, particularly those who are self-employed, they are also overpaying tax. Self-assessment taxpayers in the UK are estimated to have overpaid nearly £9 billion in income tax in the last year, according to HMRC's own data. So you can see why this group of people are ripe for exploitation. I want to thank the inevitable tax dodger hunter general, Dan Needle, for his help with this and some of the examples of what the sorts of information are that people are getting. Because let me give the House some concrete examples of what is circulating out there to our constituents as a way of dealing with this situation. 4 of these are from a particular singular influencer named Samuel Leeds, who has hundreds of thousands of followers on social media. Now, let me be clear. When this place previously debated Mr. Leeds' behaviour, he put out a video accusing us of not putting our heart into dealing with him. Well, let me tell you, Mr. Leeds, if you're watching now, I'm going to put a hell of a lot more than my heart into making sure that you are held accountable for the damage that you are doing. Because he claims he doesn't just know a lot about the tax, he also knows a lot about the law. That's like me saying I know a lot about flying a plane because I've been in one occasionally. Here are 5 examples of the sorts of things that he is saying. First of all, he claims that you can buy a rundown property, renovate it, sell it, and pay no capital gains tax because you can just claim it was your main residence. He claims that he's done it himself multiple times. That advice is simply wrong. Section 224/3 of the Taxation of Chargeable Gains Act 1992 strips the main residency exemption from any property acquired with the purpose of making a gain. And the case law is equally clear. If you never intended to make it your settled home, it was never your residence at all. This law kills that wheeze twice over. Our constituents who might follow that advice face not just capital gains tax, but potentially income tax at an even higher rate if the taxman decides, frankly rightly, that they were doing is a property development trade. His second well-known wheeze is that you should put your spouse and your kids, some as young as 13, on your company payroll, pay them £12,500 each and extract the cash tax-free. Sounds brilliant, doesn't it? I can't wait till my children get older. Except it's not if they're not doing genuine work. It's not a deductible expense. And for any child under 14, that may be, well, illegal. We're not talking about a grey area here, yet that advice has been shared millions and millions of times. Third claim, put your property in a trust and you can protect it from inheritance tax entirely. Again, flat out wrong. Gift your children your home, stay living it and pay 0 inheritance tax. Again, flat out wrong. If you continue to live in a property after gifting it, which is precisely what most people would do, inheritance tax is charged as if the gift has never been made. The 7-year clock people might be aware of never even starts. The 5th claim that's being circulated by many of the FinTok people is that holidays and almost anything else can be claimed as a deductible business expense. As one Finfluencer, Abby Hookway, put it in a video, rich people don't pay for holidays. The boring reality is an expense must be wholly and exclusively for trade purposes. Holidays, of course, do not meet that test. And HMRC is actively identifying suspicious claims and people are being caught facing fines and penalties as a result of following this fraudulent activity. In total, HMRC handed out £153 million in fines across 46,000 penalties in 2023 for businesses. There's been a 38% increase in the serious penalties for what it terms deliberate errors. Last year, around 1.8 million taxpayers turned to overdrafts to pay unexpected self-assessment tax bills, according to research by Royal London. The people giving out this kind of advice need to face a penalty of their own. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Financial Conduct Authority has used its powers to regulate this space. Just last month, 7 individuals with a combined 4.5 million followers were brought to justice by the FCA for their role in promoting an unauthorised foreign exchange trading scheme. There is no reason why HMRC cannot operate in a similarly direct way if it's given the power to do so. And that means us showing the political will to recognise this problem, not wait, frankly, for too long as we did with the payday lenders and buy now, pay later companies to act. And that is why I'm asking members to support new Clause 4 and the call of change that it offers. We also need to recognise, in a world of ChatGPT and large language models, the information these people are creating is now being dragged into those servers and reproduced as if it is also correct, further compounding the damage and the need to act quickly. These people are seeking to make monetary gain from these videos, just as the people, the professional organisations identified in clauses 156 and 157 are seeking to make monetary gain from tax avoidance schemes. Madam Deputy Speaker, just as Al Capone was taken down by what he was doing on tax, so these people need to be stopped before they cause further harm. And I'll end with this. As well as farming for dodgy advice for clicks, Samuel Leeds sells his property investment advice for money. In 2019, Danny Butcher, a soldier from Doncaster, listened to that advice. He joined one of those seminars. As his widow puts it, Danny thought it was his chance. 11 weeks later, he took his own life, shamed about the amount of money that he had lost. Charlatans like Samuel Leeds need to not just be called out. We don't just need to warn our constituents about the danger of taking advice online. We need to collectively act to stop this before it gets any worse. New Clause 4 would allow us to be clear that the powers in this bill also apply to these con artists. I hope that the Minister has heard my plea for us to act quickly on this matter, and I look forward to hearing what he has to say in response. And to any of them listening, you can tag me in what you want. I will always stand up for consumers.
I call the Liberal Democrat spokesperson Charlie Maynard.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This bill and the budget it derives from demonstrate quite clearly that the Chancellor has implemented stealth tax grabs which will hit some of the lowest paid the hardest, by extending a freeze on income tax thresholds and with the national insurance contributions increases which suppress employment and wages. It is full of short-sighted, harmful decisions we cannot support. Our amendments aim to highlight and reduce some of the more harmful impacts, and I'll focus on 4 particular areas today. First, the impact of frozen income tax thresholds and new clauses 15, 16 and 17, which seek to secure additional information and analysis about their impact. Worrying figures from the OBR, as already mentioned, suggest that as a result of continuing to freeze the income tax thresholds, an extra 1 million pensioners will be dragged into paying income tax for the first time by 2030-31, unless the government acts. Yes.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. He's right about pensioners being dragged into paying income tax. But does he agree with me that millions of these pensioners will want to be able to contact HMRC and ask them about these changes, where millions of people never managed to get through to HMRC, and figures from a written question I put in recently show that HMRC has lost 2,000 customer service staff in the last few years. So will he agree with me that we need a red phone hotline to allow pensioners to get hold of HMRC for the support and advice when they need it?
Thank you, and I completely agree, and that the stress of that is horrific. So the more that we can get that functioning effectively would be appreciated. While the government has said that people whose only source of income is a state pension will not pay an income tax over this Parliament, no details have been provided as to how they will be protected. So I ask the government to put an end to this uncertainty and set out plans in full explaining how exactly they intend to shield pensioners from this unfair tax hit, and we would love a timeline as to when the government will do that. More broadly, extending this stealth tax by two more years will drag an estimated 1.3 million people into a higher tax band by 29-30. That's 600,000, or just over 600,000, into the basic rate of tax, and just under 700,000 into the higher rate. These are big numbers. And we would really appreciate it if the government would explain to each of those 1.3 million people impacted what it's going to do to them, because I don't think they're aware of it right now. This disproportionately impacts those on low incomes who will be dragged into income taxes for the first time. And at the very least, we've stated to please provide that information. Next, the impact of the government's actions and inactions on youth unemployment. This is building to a real crisis point. 16% of all 16 to 24-year-olds in the country are out of work. That's almost 740,000 people. That's 100,000 people up in the last year. 100,000 people up in the last year. So something is going wrong with the government's policies there, and I really think we need to be getting to the bottom of that. So our party has tabled new clause 14, which requires the Chancellor to review and report on the impact of this bill on unemployment with particular regard to young people aged 16 to 24. And it's worth noting that this legislation, which dampens growth and hits jobs, comes at a time of broader disruption in the labour market. AI is already having an impact, particularly on entry-level so-called white-collar jobs, but it's also having impacts in pubs. So, you know, all our local pubs, I'm sure, are hiring fewer young people because there's no incentive to do so anymore. So we would really look for some help to see whether we can create a new employer's national insurance contributions band between 5,000 and 9,100 with a lower rate to incentivise employers to hire often younger part-time workers. I'll move on to the point we highlight in new clause 13 about the complexity of the tax system and the cost of administrating, and there is a green brick sitting there masquerading as a bill. What we would really like to see, and the government has such an opportunity now in this Parliament with such a majority to really do some serious thinking about how to simplify our tax code, root and branch. And what is disappointing is we see no sign of that actually happening. And you know, with that sort of size of legislation being added each time, we're just getting bigger and bigger and more complex. And that has a real burden on business. So anything you can do, and the Treasury Committee, the PAC and the Business and Trade Committee have all spoken out about this and how much damage our over-complex tax system is doing to our business, we would really appreciate it if you could get more serious about that. So if the government could get more serious about that. Finally, on agricultural and business property relief, we welcome the government's U-turn and we wish it had not taken a year of stress and fear, and farmers and business owners in my constituency have just lived that, and it's been hell for them and their families. But we're very grateful for that to have happened and appreciate that. However, the government has now picked static thresholds which do not rise with either land values or the cost of living. This means the benefits to farmers will be eroded and business owners will be eroded year after... Certainly.
Thank you. We welcomed the government's changes on APR relief with the new 2.5 million threshold just before Christmas. But does my honourable friend still share my concern that genuinely active, long-held family farms and long-standing tenant farming arrangements will still be penalised by the government, and members should therefore back the Liberal Democrat amendment, which would maintain the relief at 100% where the property has been owned by the transferor for at least 10 years as part of a business that is actively operated by the transferor or a family member.
Yeah. I thank my honourable friend for speaking up on that, and I know our other honourable friend, right honourable friend, member for Westmoreland Lonsdale, feels very strongly about it as well. So thank you for mentioning that. Just going back to that fixed, static threshold, we don't really understand why the government has decided to go with that, because everybody recognises that agricultural land values go up. Everybody recognises the cost of living goes up. So we would really appreciate it if the government could explain why it has decided not to index that. And for that reason, we will therefore be pushing new clause 11 to a vote, because we really want to see that fixed. Thank you.
Gareth Snell.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I would like to speak to the two amendments that stand solely in my name relating to the impact of the changes to remote gaming and remote betting duty. Now, I don't intend, Madam Deputy Speaker, to try and relitigate the rights and wrongs of those changes. I think we've had a number of debates upon those across this place and in Westminster Hall where the determination of that has sort of almost been settled by Treasury. But I do think it's important that we consider what I believe are genuinely unintended consequences of those changes as a result of what the Treasury will introduce and how we do our best to mitigate them. But to mitigate them, we need to understand them. So my first new clause is new clause 8, and it simply seeks to get an independent assessment of the impact of the changes to remote betting and remote gaming duty on the black market. Now, for those of us in this place that have been participating in debates around gaming and gambling, I think we all accept there are challenges that we need to address with problem gambling. That requires people to be participating in the regulated sector where the help and the support is available for those people that find themselves getting into trouble. The more people we push into the black market where there is no support, there is no GAM care, there is no lockout system, it means people are more at risk of harmful activity and being preyed upon by predatory organisations and companies that are outside of the UK, do not pay taxes here and are simply not worried about the participants. Now, the independent study done by Ernst & Young for the Betting and Gaming Council did come up that there is a potential for £6 billion worth of stakes to be diverted into the black market as a result of this change. That's £6 billion of stakes that were going to be made somewhere but will go into the black market. They will therefore not be subject to any taxation, any form of potential corporation tax if they're being staked outside of the UK and one of the companies headquartered elsewhere, or to the remote gaming duty as a result of these changes. That is a 140% increase on the potential stakes going into the black market. That's thousands and thousands of people, our constituents, who will find themselves in an unregulated part of the gambling and gaming economy where there is absolutely no help and support for them. And the people that run those sites have no interest in the welfare of those individuals whatsoever. They simply want to try and maximise their profits. And every single one of us is no more than 2 clicks away from an unregulated gaming or gambling site where again, that money often goes into questionable activities overseas. Some of it is funding organised crime. In some cases, it's also funding terrorism activities overseas. And we should be open and acknowledge that fact. Now, I recognise that the Treasury has, as part of the broader changes to the betting and gaming regulations, have identified £26 million to the Gaming Commission in order to try and mitigate some of the worst aspects of that. But to be honest, we just simply don't know how big the impact is going to be. The assessment simply hasn't been done by government to determine whether that £26 million is enough. And frankly, every penny that we could spend on helping people avoid damaging gaming and enjoying regulated gaming and gambling in this country should be spent. I'll give way.
I'm wondering if the government has given the honourable member any idea on when a post-implementation review might be looked at on this legislation, and whether the Treasury will therefore be able to say, or when the Treasury will be able to say, how much taxation they have gathered and how much has been lost as a result of these changes.
That's an incredibly fair question. The Treasury haven't been able to give me an answer to that question, but it's one of the questions that I'm hoping the Minister will be able to answer in summation, because regardless of anybody's views on gambling, what we need to make sure is that the implementation of new levies doesn't drive people into the black market, because this is where they're most exposed, where they're most at risk. And if people are going to be participating in gaming and betting, I would much rather it happened inside a UK-based regulated service where they can get their help and support, and where the taxes that they do pay do go towards funding our public services. So it's a fair point, and I hope the Minister will be able to provide an answer to it. I also wonder if the Minister, when he's summing up, could also give some thought to this level of taxation has been hypothecated in narrative to being directly to fund the welcome changes that this government's going to make to the two-child benefit cap. But that reality is that's not how taxation in this country works. We don't hypothecate specific taxation lines to pay for specific social policy. It goes into the Treasury pot, and the Treasury, in its infinite wisdom and benevolence, hands it out to other departments who make spending commitments to it. Now, the government's own OBR forecast suggests that with behavioural changes taking place as a result of the differential rates that will exist between the regulated and unregulated sector and those people that will pay tax, potentially the yield of this tax take will be down by a third by 2029-2030, potentially up to somewhere in the region of £300 million loss. So if we're making this direct comparison to say that this levy is necessary and needed in order to fund the welcome change to the two-child benefit cap, is the Minister able to set out where the additional funding will come in 2029-2030 if this level of reduction because of behavioural changes takes place? But again, if they were able to support my amendment, even though in action after tonight's debate, to do a proper assessment of impact, then we would at least understand where those future challenges are, both in behaviour of consumers and impact on yield. New Clause 9, Madam Deputy Speaker, seeks to, a similar impact assessment, but this time in relation to our friends in Gibraltar. Now, the Minister will be acutely aware that the gaming and gambling sector in Gibraltar is a huge part of their economy. 30% of Gibraltar's GDP comes from the sector. It employs 3,500 people, and the gambling companies that have a footprint and the gaming companies that have a footprint in Gibraltar pay both Gibraltar corporation tax as well as any levies paid in the UK. But because of the way, because it is a top-line tax rather than a bottom-line tax, any impact on the profitability of companies that are based in Gibraltar or any change in behaviour in terms of the stakes that are put through those companies has an immediate and direct impact on the revenues of Gibraltar. 1/3 of Gibraltar's tax receipts come from this sector. So anything that we do in this place, that, and again, I entirely accept this is not an intended consequence of the decision, but anything that we do in this place that has an impact on the sector in Gibraltar will leave a huge hole in the Gibraltar economy, which will have to be filled. And we are talking about potentially tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of pounds. Gibraltar, of course, is one of the family of nations that make up the UK and make up Britain, and we've got to make sure that, given the strategic importance they now hold because of our defence work, that we aren't doing anything that makes them less safe as a result of our tax changes here. Of course, the Gibraltar Parliament and Government are currently putting through the changes to the EU-Gibraltar Treaty, which again is helping with the flow of that workforce that work in the gaming sector and the cross-border nature of that workforce. But what Nigel Feetham, the Member of Parliament, the Gibraltar Parliament that has the brief for tax, for trade and for enterprise, has said is what Gibraltar really needs is stability. What they need is, and he says, not to have avoidable decisions made in the UK. And I think what I would ask in terms of the amendment that's down this evening, that I know the government is going to resist, but could the Minister lay out what communications he has had, what active engagement the Treasury has had with our friends in Gibraltar? Because Gibraltar is of strategic importance to us. It is part of the family of nations that make up who we are, and decisions that we take in this finance bill are having a huge impact on their economy and on their ability to fund their public services and fund their defence, their contribution to our overall national defence. Whilst they are also embedding their new treaty changes, having some certainty about their revenue stream is for them also important. Now, the media is reporting that the Gibraltar government are now looking at diversification rapidly of their economy in order to make up for the difference. But we don't know what the impact is going to be realistically on our economy, and they certainly don't know what the impact is going to be on theirs. And the Minister will be acutely aware that when you are dependent upon 30% of your tax intake from one sector, even a small change in the UK here could have a huge detrimental impact over there. So that stability that the Gibraltar Parliament has been asking for, that Nigel Feetham has rightly been asking for in his engagements with the Treasury, is something that I hope the Minister can address this evening. And finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, I wasn't intending to, but just to touch on the Honourable Gentleman from Norfolk's new Clause 10, I think, about CBAM. I've often talked about the importance of our manufacturing industries in this place, not least the ceramic industry, which falls outside the current proposals for CBAM, but will be subject to the emissions trading scheme. There is a perversity about the emissions trading scheme and CBAM, which is, if we get it wrong, we just drive up price for consumers and we drive up price for producers. At the same time, there are countries that are producing ceramics, importing into our country using cheap Russian gas, which means that their price point is much below what we can produce here. It also has the distorting effect that our exports become more expensive overseas where they hit the CBAM, particularly for Europe. So whilst we are in a point of global turmoil, whilst gas prices are hugely increasing overnight. The price per therm was 74 pence last week. It's now somewhere around 160 pence per therm. There is some work to be done by Treasury, and I did ask the Chancellor about this in her statement on Monday. Unfortunately, she missed the point about gas-intensive industry and went straight to electric-intensive industry, which are very different. But when the government is looking at the way in which we do CBAM and where we're going to have free allowances for ETS, can he bear in mind those small industries like ceramics those small sectors like ceramics, but who are crucial to our foundational manufacturing? I'm not talking about the tiles and tableware and the giftware that so often I talk about, but actually The advanced ceramics that we need in this country are dependent upon a gas price that works, being able to trade across the European border without there being huge external tariffs placed on it because of carbon leakage. The nuclear submarine air filtration systems are ceramic. The rotor blades that go on small modular reactors made over in Derby are going to require a ceramic powder coating that's going to have to cross many borders in order for them to be utilised. There are potentials that we price out British manufacturers as a result of CBAM and ETS if we don't have some of those lifelong allowances and if we don't think about where the interplay between components that travel over borders are. So whilst I wasn't intending to speak on his new clause 10, he makes a very valid point, and from a point from ceramics, I do hope the Minister is able to take forward, maybe not the amendment, which obviously won't be supporting this evening because it's not a government amendment, but the point that the Honourable Gentleman raised are worthy to be considered in a different form.
Katie Lamb.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Since the government announced their tax raid on family farms, they've made numerous false claims about this policy and about what it will mean for farmers. Raising the threshold, as the government proposes to do today, does not fix these fundamental wrongs at the heart of this awful policy, and I would like to speak in favour of Amendment 6, laid in the name of my honourable friend, the member for North West Norfolk, which will remove these problems altogether by doing away with this pernicious tax. So what are these claims? The government has claimed that farmers are rich and so can afford to bear the cost of tax increases. To the surprise of nobody who actually works on a farm, this myth is born from a fundamental misunderstanding of how agriculture works. A farm is not simply another asset. It is not like a share portfolio where you can sell a little today, buy a little tomorrow. The assets of a farm, primarily its land, its crops or livestock, and its equipment, are huge, long-term investments, completely inseparable from the ability to produce whatever it makes. There is often little relationship between the value of the land held by a farmer and the profitability of that farm. This is particularly true at a time when, to sell their produce at all, farmers must abide by a seemingly endless list of regulations, all of which drive up costs and reduce profit margins. Farmers tolerate a rock-bottom level of return on investment that most businesses would never consider. Ministers have also claimed that farmers can simply give their farms away 7 years before they die and avoid paying the tax altogether, that this is just a way for the government to encourage a handover to the next generation. This is absurd. Firstly, for the government to introduce a tax while encouraging the victims of that tax to avoid it. Secondly, to imply that people can predict when they are going to die. And thirdly, if this is really what they were trying to achieve, why was there not a delay of 7 years to enact this policy? But perhaps the most egregious falsehood of all was the claim that the government had no choice but to impose this tax on farmers. Ministers first argued that they desperately needed the £500 million they initially said this would raise. Since changing the threshold, they've claimed they must have the £300 million they've now say it will provide. For what, one might reasonably ask? After all, if farmers are being asked to tighten their belts and pay extra tax, surely the government has been exceptionally careful in its spending habits. In fact, this government has spent £3.6 billion on lifting the two-child benefit cap, designed to give more money to those who don't work. They're planning to spend £3.4 billion for the privilege of handing over the Chagos Islands to Mauritius, though we can yet hope this so-called deal may be cancelled. And they're spending £1 billion on yet more failed energy policies, which will drive up costs for consumers. So did the government really need to punish farmers to the tune of £300 million? Or have they, instead, decided to carry out a cynical tax raid on the people who feed us in order to fund a series of ideological hobby horses? It's not as if this was an emergency tax hike to keep the lights on. In fact, their plans for more renewable energy could very well leave us facing blackouts. Again and again, this government punishes those who are doing the right thing, as my right honourable friend said earlier, taking money from those who work hard to fund those who don't work at all, or to spend big on ideological projects which nobody has ever asked for and which nobody has ever voted. This policy isn't just nonsensical, it is deeply immoral. This is no way to treat the people, including those in the Weald of Kent, who go to work, some of the toughest work you can imagine, every single day, often for long and unsociable hours, to keep our country fed. Amendment 6 will put a stop to this appalling tax, and I am delighted to support it today.
Henry Tufnell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the introduction of the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, in this bill. It shows a commitment from this government to support British industry, which underpins the fabric of local economies and communities across the country, including mine in Mid and South Pembrokeshire. For British industries included in its scope, a CBAM means they can compete on a level playing field with industries in the global market. It works by applying a charge to the carbon emitted during the production of imported carbon-intensive goods. This ensures that our domestic producers don't face higher production costs compared to their foreign competitors operating in countries where the price of carbon is lower. This is critical. Without a CBAM, these industries will go elsewhere, moving to production to low regulation, high emission countries. We would lose jobs, investment, and our industrial base, while simply offshoring our emissions. This is carbon leakage. Decarbonisation at the cost of deindustrialisation. It would be devastating for industrial communities like mine in Mid and South Pembrokeshire and across the country. That is why I'm calling on the government to expand the scope of the CBAM to include the oil refining industry. Refined petroleum products are highly exposed to carbon leakage, and without the protection of the CBAM, we risk losing this industry. This would have untold consequences for communities like mine in Pembrokeshire, which is the home of one of the UK's 4 remaining oil refineries. Locally, the refining sector employs over 1,000 people. Nationally, it accounts for 15% of Welsh GDP exports. Oil refinery continues to be foundational to the UK's economy and energy security. Oil products supply 47% of the UK's final energy demand and support thousands of skilled jobs in industrial communities like Pembrokeshire. The transition to net zero must be a just one. It cannot come at the cost of deindustrialisation and greater economic deprivation in communities like mine. Madam Deputy Speaker, as the party of working people, it is incumbent on this Labour government to manage this energy transition, protecting the jobs and skills base of today while building the industries of tomorrow. Recent global events have shown once again how trade flows can change overnight, threatening our energy security and directly impacting the cost of living for our constituents. As a government, we must be agile in responding, providing the support and certainty our communities and industries need to weather these storms. A CBAM can provide targeted support to industry during turbulent times. However, the bill in its current form only requires the effectiveness of the CBAM to be reviewed after 5 years. I hardly need to remind the House how dramatically the geopolitical landscape can change in that time. That is why I would also urge the Minister to consider making provisions for yearly reviews of the CBAM during its first 5 years. This would allow Treasury to respond to unforeseen events and ensure that the CBAM continues to achieve its objective, minimising the risk of carbon leakage for carbon-intensive industries in the UK, so that our decarbonisation efforts lead to a true reduction in global emissions, rather than simply displacing carbon emissions overseas. We are at a critical juncture for British industry. Decisions made by this government will shape the UK's ability to safeguard industrial jobs, maintain global competitiveness, while meeting net zero objectives and creating jobs for the future without simply offshoring our emissions. This bill continues the government's work to build a stronger, fairer country, growing our economy, raising living standards and, crucially, investing in our public services. The introduction of the CBAM is a vital part of this broader package of measures, but I would urge the Minister to consider expanding its scope and reviewing it annually to ensure that it delivers on its important objectives in a rapidly changing world.
Robbie Moore.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I rise to speak about the changes that have been made in relation to inheritance tax, which is impacting many of our family farming businesses, but also those family businesses that operate in many of our constituencies. And I rise specifically to speak to Amendments 89 and 90, which, if agreed, will remove the liability for inheritance tax on the share of a tenancy at arm's length which transfers on death. Madam Deputy Speaker, this government's ill handling of the family farm tax has left our farmers in limbo, their confidence in tatters, and thanks to Labour's disastrous family farm and family business tax, our farmers and many hard-working businesses have spent over a year navigating an already challenging time for a sector with added anxiety and uncertainty hanging over their heads. Despite the warnings from the entire farming community, this government has pushed ahead with the tax, creating chaos, fear and real damage. And I will give way to the honourable member.
Thank you. I'm grateful to the honourable member for giving way. And would you agree with me that the way the government have approached this has actually hurt their main aim, which is economic growth? Farmers have delayed ordering, and actually, because of the new rules that are in, there's no incentive to grow your farm over that £2.5 million threshold.
Robbie Moore.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And the honourable member makes an excellent point, because with the changes, despite the minimal partial U-turn that the government made with increasing that threshold from £1 million to £2.5 million, it's still impacting many of our farming businesses and therefore the wider supply chain. And this has a negative impact not only from the level of investment that a family business is willing to put into their business, but has a hugely detrimental impact on the wider supply chain, from investment in agricultural machinery, stocks that might be willing to be purchased, etc. And that is having a massive detrimental impact on the real rural economy right now. I will give way.
Member for giving way, and he is speaking very powerfully on this issue. DAERA in Northern Ireland have estimated that 4,500 farms still will be impacted with the set changes, mainly in the dairy industry. Would he agree with me that, given the need for food security, we need to protect our farms, not to do away with them?
We absolutely do, Madam Deputy Speaker. And the point that the honourable member makes is an excellent one, because we all know that the value of farmland in Northern Ireland is proportionately higher to anywhere else within the United Kingdom, and therefore there is a huge proportion of Northern Ireland farmers who are working incredibly hard, 4,500 of them, who are still going to be impacted by the rate relief change that this Labour government has implemented, that are going to be detrimentally impacted, and it impacts the rural economy, having that detrimental impact. Now, despite this partial U-turn, by increasing the level of agricultural and business property relief threshold from £1 million to £2.5 million for inheritance tax, the government risks once again showing its disregard to the farming community should it neglect to support Amendments 89 and 90, which seeks to address yet another measure seemingly designed to punish our farmers. The Tenant Farmers Association is a dedicated organisation that represents the interests of all of those who do not own land within our farming community, but are heavily involved in supporting the tenanted sector. And I spoke with members of the TFA just this morning, and their Chief Executive, George Dunn, who is, with his excellent knowledge and commitment to the tenanted sector, has provided many a briefing to many a member in this House. But it's deeply disappointing that members on the opposite benches are not supporting, or don't seem to be supporting, Amendments 89 and 90, which we are debating this evening. Now, should the House fail to amend the bill, as suggested by my right honourable friend, the member for Central Devon, at Schedule 12, but also co-signed by my right honourable friend, the member for Horncastle, Loughton Horncastle, and myself, Those who inherit a share of a joint tenancy have no means to capitalise on that share, whilst also having no way to liquidate the asset in the context of continuing business to allow them to pay the tax liability. To date, the value of any inherited portion of a business or agricultural tenancy held jointly following the death of one of the joint tenants has been fully relievable, either through agricultural property relief or business property relief. Given that in most cases it will be impossible for the surviving joint tenant or tenants to realise the value of any inherited share of the tenancy on death, it is completely unfair that this tax that the Labour government is bringing out should be levied. The unfairness is underlined by the fact that an input value for the share of the joint tenancy would have to be calculated on the profit rent basis, which is the best at theoretical value in any case, which just blows out of context the real damage that is being implemented by this Labour government. Therefore, I urge the government to learn from their previous mistake and listen to our farmers and protect the value of joint tenancies by supporting these amendments this evening. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, Amendment 88 seeks to delay the triggering of the instalments that are going to be brought forward by the payment of inheritance tax from the current period of 6 months by 12 months to a full 18-month period. And the reason why this is so important, Madam Deputy Speaker, and what I feel the government fails to realise is how complex it is valuing the assets that are likely to be subjected to an IHT liability. And when you're looking at our farming businesses, you're not only valuing the farmland, there may be a farmhouse, a cottage or two, the livestock, the machinery, the growing crops, the crops in store will all have a value associated with them. And therefore it is complex to ascertain that value within the 6-month period that the government have already outlined. And it gets more complicated than that, Madam Deputy Speaker, because we find ourselves in a bizarre scenario where we now have the potential of 2 assets on death with a value of 5 million being subjected to different IHT liabilities depending on the ownership structure and whether or not the spousal allowance is being utilised, therefore exposing any tax liability on death to challenge, quite rightly, by those where the tax liability sits, and therefore to have a deadline of 6 months in which that tax liability through instalments has to be payable and triggered is just simply not going to be sustained. And therefore I urge the government to support Amendment 89 in my name and that of the official opposition.
Will my friend give way?
I will give way.
My friend's making an excellent speech. Like me, I'm sure he's received many emails and letters from farmers over the last few days in light of recent uncertain events, with the price of red diesel going up, the price of heating oil going up, fertiliser rising. And does just not demonstrate and remind us all how fragile farming businesses are, and the idea they're going to have sufficient money sitting in the bank to pay this tax bill is just for the birds.
And Madam Deputy Speaker, is absolutely for the birds, as my right honourable friend indicates, because the realities of this is our farming businesses are not only being attacked through the changes through inheritance tax, but the complications and additional burden through the challenges with cash flow. We've already seen de-linked payments dramatically drop for many of our farming businesses. SFI has been chopped, changed, moved around, and now we're not quite sure what the fundamentals will be when the new SFI is rolled out in summer of this year. But the reality of it is that, coupled with the additional financial costs with red diesel going up, has been realised by many of those constituents of my right honourable friend, and I'm sure across the House, challenges with cash flow increase, and therefore when the government is putting an additional burden on a potential IHT liability, it's only increasing the level of anxiety amongst our farming community. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, this morning, in addition to meeting the Tenant Farmers Association, I also met with the CLA and the presidential team there, Gavin Lane, who very clearly put across to me that, and continues quite rightly to campaign on the family farm tax issue, that it must be ultimately abolished altogether, which is why on this side of the House we want to reiterate our commitment that the 100% relief will go back in for agricultural property relief and business property relief if we're lucky enough to be back in government. And finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, the issue of indexation, because with the thresholds being set at £2.5 million, it takes no account of the value of farmland increasing further down the line, and therefore our farming community and indeed those family businesses are being further impacted by the rise of the value of assets further down the line and the threshold being maintained at 2.5 million. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, it is clear that we are still here at the final stages of the Finance Bill progressing through the House, and we do not have any further clarity from the Government as to the timings associated with extending the payment or beyond the 6-month period to 18-month period that we are requesting. We have no certainty that indexation will be linked to the threshold that has been increased, although minimally, and we have no realisation from the Government that they actually get how our farming community operates. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, I hope that the Government will consider Amendment 88, 89, 90 and those associated amendments which are in my name and those on the front bench, and ultimately agree with, hopefully, Amendment 6, which scraps the family farm tax and the family farm business tax in its full entirety.
Alex Ballinger.
Deputy Speaker, before I start, I should declare I am co-chair of the All-Party Group for Gambling Reform. I wanted to talk to New Clause 8 and New Clause 9, which the member for Stoke-on-Trent Central was speaking to earlier in the debate. I thought very thoughtful, well-meaning clauses that raise real concerns. I just wanted to add a bit of context to the evidence, what it shows around the black market and what it shows about the situation in Gibraltar. So firstly, there are often industries that are associated with harm that often use the black market as an excuse to avoid regulation or additional taxation. I remember when I was on the Finance Bill Committee last year, we received a lot of correspondence from the tobacco industry that was making the same sort of claim as we were intending to increase. The Shadow Minister might remember the debate where we spoke, was intending to, we're intending to increase taxes, and they were using the black market as an excuse not to do that. However, in the gambling sector, the threat of the black market is overblown. The regulated market is dominant, and there have been lots of other changes in recent years, changes to taxation that haven't increased the size of the black market. And I'll give two examples. When we changed in the UK from taxing turnover to profit in 2001, the black market was raised as a risk then, and there were no real changes. And again, when we introduced the point of consumption tax in 2014, again, there was no surge in unregulated or the black market gambling at that point either. And indeed, there was a study by the Gambling Commission in 2021, which found only a very small proportion of UK gamblers ever used unlicensed sites. And these were mostly by accident, although the member for Stoke-on-Trent accurately raises that there are also people who are banned from using regulated sites that sometimes turn to the unregulated sector, and that truly is a problem. So I would like to say that focusing on the black market does risk diverting attention away from the significant and better evidence harms that we do see in the regulated sector, and these harms are highest in the areas that we're seeking to increase taxes, as we've talked about already, so I won't go into that too much. However, I do think it's important that we're tackling the black market, and therefore I welcome the illegal gambling task force that's been introduced, as well as the additional £26 million the Gambling Commission has to address both of these issues. But I think we should not buy into the narrative that risks from the black market should stop us making changes that keep people safe from the most harmful forms of gambling. And just very quickly to address New Clause 9 on Gibraltar, I think if the tax changes are going to be as economically damaging as claimed for Gibraltar, we do need to consider how it works in other jurisdictions, because there are often the same gambling organisations operate in other countries with much higher tax rates than the UK, and they manage to survive profitably in those sectors. So I think we should take that into consideration when we're looking at the impact on Gibraltar as well. Thank you.
Kirsty Blackman.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. You would not believe, Madam Deputy Speaker, how beyond delighted I was when I discovered I would be stepping in for a colleague in the Finance Bill. And I'm sure the House is a similar level of ecstatic to hear me speak on the Finance Bill. I was truly missing, the fact that I did a significant number of finance bills in my first few years in this place, and I was really missing it. I was also missing the previous member for Amber Valley, Nigel Mills, who used to stand up on that front bench and make a speech. about something that nobody else had even considered existed. The member for Stoke-on-Trent is very kindly stepping into his shoes and raising issues around gambling tax, which are, to be fair, important, and he's asking very important questions, as Nigel Mills previously did, but on a fairly niche subject. I would too be interested, though, to see the results of the comments that he made around gambling tax and what might happen with the black market. It would be great if the Treasury would be willing to provide updates on how that tax has worked. In fact, I think the Treasury generally should provide more updates on every tax measure that they implement, because if they say that a tax measure is going to raise £30 million, it would be helpful for the MPs who were on the finance bill, for example, to know if it did raise £30 million, or if it in fact raised £50 million, or if it in fact raised £10 million, because then we would be able to make better decisions in future about tax changes, because we would have a better idea of whether or not things did achieve the aims that were put in. The government is successive governments are particularly bad at undertaking post-implementation reviews, particularly of some of the tax measures that take place. I think it would be really handy to see that information more regularly so that we can make better informed decisions. And I was just going to touch on the issues that were mentioned around transparency. I raised already my concerns about the Ways and Means resolution and the fact that additional ones were added at this point. I also raised the fact that we don't have oral evidence sessions during the course of the finance bill. I continue to make the case that this could be done after committee of the whole House, because usually the more technical aspects of the finance bill are included in the finance bill committee, in the committee rooms, rather than in the chamber for the committee of the whole House. And the Minister has said that some of the government amendments that have been made have been as a result of stakeholder feedback, particularly in written evidence, but of stakeholder feedback in order to clarify the intention of the legislation as it was anyway. So the government had intended to do something, stakeholders said, we don't really understand this, or it's not clear enough, please could you clarify this? If they'd had those oral evidence sessions, they may have been able to make the changes at committee stage rather than bringing it back at report stage. I would urge the government, and any government, to consider putting in those oral evidence sessions. Anyone who is sat on a bill committee will, with evidence sessions, will understand the absolute value of those and the number of times throughout the course of the bill committee that we refer back to those oral evidence sessions, because there's nothing quite like being able to ask an expert those questions rather than just looking at the written evidence, which is helpful, but is not the same. You don't remember it in the same way. You don't get this, have the same ability to probe into it. Specifically talking about the amendments that there are today, I want to touch on the 4 that I expect may be put to votes. The new clause 4 that was moved from the benches over there, I'm happy to support that. The SNP are happy to support that. I think I was thinking about the history of some of these get-rich-quick schemes that we've seen previously, about the fact that we had Ponzi schemes and pyramid schemes, and they were this is the kind of Ponzi scheme of the day. Is the new thing that says this is foolproof, this is fail-safe, you're going to make loads of money doing this, but actually is unregulated. And I think that the amendment that has been put forward is incredibly helpful. I would have preferred if social media said user-to-user services, so it covered all of the stuff that's within the Online Safety Bill, Online Safety Act, because that might cover things that we may not classically define as social media. For example, if you were on money-saving experts forums and somebody gave tax advice that was really terrible, would that be included in the definition of social media or not? Because social media is not 100% defined. That's why I would have preferred to see it differently. However, I think the amendment that has been put down is absolutely sufficient to cover the majority of these people.
I feel the need to stand up for Martin Lewis, because actually he's one of the good guys in terms of advice, and I think they police their forums very well. It's people exploiting the fact that social media companies also have a vested interest in generating content that goes viral. So they are sole publishers to make these videos, to make money from them, telling you outlandish things you can do with your taxes. The Money Saving Expert Forum, I think we'd all agree it's worth looking at that. Again, I peruse it at length myself, much to the detriment of being able to make decisions.
It is absolutely worth looking at that. But then people that are, as the Honourable Member has said in the new clause, people that are promoting schemes that have no expectation of actually working shouldn't be doing it on money-saving expert forums or anywhere else. And I absolutely agree that Martin Lewis has been very clear that he does not give advice online, and that people who, for example, say this is a Martin Lewis tip are lying when they're doing that. And I think it's worth highlighting the way that he has chosen to put forward tax advice or information is a totally different way to these financial influencers that are being spoken about in new clause 4. But as I said, I am more than happy to support it. I would have just liked to see it a bit wider. In terms of the other new clauses and amendments that are being moved today, new clause 11 on the uprating of the agricultural relief that's been put forward by the Liberal Democrats, again, we are happy to support it. If the clause is not to be implemented, if the uprating is not to be implemented, I think it would be incredibly useful to see from the government their rationale for why they've chosen to do it this way, for why they've chosen not to do the annual uprating in a way that would be standard with the majority of other reliefs, and what the logic is for this. As I was not in the Bill Committee, I'm not as across this specific part of the bill as I perhaps should be, so I'm not clear what the mechanism is in place in order to uprate that relief. Is it by negative statutory instrument? Is it by affirmative statutory instrument? Will the House actually see it, or is it just delegated authority given to the Minister? Because it would be helpful to have an idea of what that mechanism is, and whether the government expects that, for example, if we continue to see inflation running at the rate it is or going up again, if we continue to see that, will there be likely to be an increase put in place in order to ensure that agricultural relief continues to wash its face, if you see what I mean, to provide the relief it's supposed to relieve? Yes.
I thank the Honourable Member for giving way on that point, and I wholeheartedly endorse what she's saying in support of new clause 11, the Liberal Democrat amendment. Lots of my farmers in North Cornwall are constantly telling me that they're pleased at the decision of the government to reverse course on the family farm tax, but it's essential now that they keep the rising prices in mind, exactly as the Honourable Member has been outlining.
Absolutely agree, and I think that where we are just now with the uncertainty in the Middle East, we're both seeing an increase in the fuel prices, which will heavily impact farmers, but also an increase in fertiliser prices, which have been really difficult to get hold of since Russia invaded Ukraine at all. The prices have gone through the roof, and therefore farmers need support. We rely on growing food. In this ever more uncertain world with international issues, we really rely on growing our own food. And therefore, I think the government needs to consider, and all governments need to consider, whether we want to be self-sufficient in terms of food, whether we want to get anywhere close to self-sufficient in terms of food, or whether we're happy to see those farms be dismantled into ever larger Australian-style sheep farms with thousands of sheep on them and nothing else. We need to consider what future there is for our farmers and ensure that we're backing that future. In terms of Amendment 5 that's been put forward by the Conservatives, we're not going to take part in that because it relates to income tax thresholds, which are devolved and do not apply in Scotland. But Amendment 6 that's been put forward by the Conservatives on APR and BPR, we will be happy to support the Conservatives in relation to that amendment. The points, I supported a lot of the points that were made around agricultural property relief and the changes that there are. Just to touch on the business property relief and the family businesses that there are, I'm concerned as a result of conversations with businesses in my constituency that you will see an increase in the number of fire sales that there are, because suddenly family businesses will become liable for significant amounts of tax, but the assets are not liquid. You can't just take that cash and give it to the taxman. You have to sell a significant part of the business, and you've got to do it within a very tight timescale. Even if the government was to be more flexible on the timescales around that, it still would be disastrous, but you wouldn't have a fire sale in the way that you may have to. And given that some family businesses have got people who are older as the people that have got shares in that business or responsible for that business, you might see very soon major issues occurring with these businesses having to sell big chunks in order to just pay tax bills.
Yeah, to endorse actually what the honourable member is saying, because what I can't get my head around is there are so many family businesses beyond the agricultural sector that are going to be impacted by the business property relief threshold of 2.5 million. Manufacturing business, hospitality sector, many of those businesses will be in many Labour MPs' constituencies. And that's why I can't understand throughout the course of this finance bill why many Labour MPs have been silent specifically on the issue of business property relief and not standing up for many of their family businesses on this very issue. And I just want to endorse the points that the honourable member is absolutely making on fire sales will happen as a result of an increased IHT liability.
Actually, I think that, given we have a Labour government who care about workers' rights, the family businesses that I have visited have got a very strong worker involvement in their businesses. The people that work there are cared for and looked after because it's a family business. And you'd think that the Labour Party would want to support more of those rather than encouraging people to get out of that place. So I do agree. I've got big concerns on that. I want to touch on the couple of amendments that we put in. My colleague from Aberdeenshire North and Moray East has put in a number of amendments. In fact, he's actually in Westminster Hall speaking in a debate he's leading in just a few minutes ago, which is why he's not able to move them himself. I would like to move the amendments in his name, and I would like to talk about the reasons for those amendments. Firstly, on APR, my colleague has put in amendments in relation to the anti-forestalling clauses. I knew I was going to say that wrong. Raising the threshold was welcome. We are pleased. Sorry. We are pleased that the threshold was raised. However, the backdating of that, the fact that in 2020, it relates to things from 2024 onwards, rather than from April 2026, is a concern. My colleague put down a number of amendments specifically in relation to this anti-forestalling issues that there are there, and asked for those changes to be made so that there's not backdating on the transactions. A number of agricultural organisations and farmers in his constituency had asked for those changes to be made, which is why he put that forward. I believe that if the government continues to push forward with this, despite the fact that they have raised the threshold, which was welcome, it's not enough. Actually, either cancelling it completely, as has been suggested by the Conservatives, or looking at that date would be incredibly helpful in order to ensure that it's not backdated, it's not retrospective. People are not losing relief on changes that were made previous to even the budget. These changes were announced. My colleagues also put down amendments in relation to whisky duty, taking out clause 86. We've seen over the last 3 years an 18% hike in whisky duty. An 18% hike. The figures show that there will be a £600 million downgrade in receipts as a result of continuing to increase this tax. Increasing the tax will reduce the receipts. It will mean that jobs in Scotland are put at risk as a result of the changes that are made, and the government will get less money. I don't understand the logic of continuing with pushing ahead with raising whisky duty. We really want the government to think again. To be fair, the 18% hike over 3 years was both of you, so you've not got a huge amount of high ground on this side of the House, I'm afraid. It's an issue that has happened from both groups, but we will continue to fight on behalf of Scottish whisky producers that the tax on spirits really needs to be looked at seriously, because this is a really important part of the Scottish economy, providing jobs in rural areas where depopulation is a really big issue. We need these companies to continue, and if the government continues to raise tax and hike the tax rates on this, we will see those jobs dropping off. And just lastly, I wanted to touch on Amendment 140, which has not been selected. Amendment 140 is the only amendment that was put forward by our merry band of Reform colleagues. They signed some other ones, but the only one that they actually put forward was Amendment 140. If anyone's looked at Amendment 140, which you would presume is Reform's key priority, given it's the only one they've put forward. It removes Clause 88. Clause 88 increases cigar duty. The main priority from Reform in the entire finance bill is that the government shouldn't be allowed to increase duty on cigars. I think that says a huge amount about those that sit on the bench behind us, about their priorities for the general people. Also, I mean, they're not here, to be fair, as either. That was truly brilliant. They're also not here. But if that is their key priority, if that, in all of the craziness that we are facing in the world, of all of the issues that are being faced by farmers, that are being faced by businesses, that are being faced by people who are being badly advised by people making up tax advice on the internet, your key priority is let's not increase the price of cigars, then I think you've got something wrong in the way that you are dealing with things. I've laid out exactly how the SNP is going to deal with each of the votes that will be put forward, including the abstention on the income tax threshold, because it does not apply in Scotland. I'm very clear that we've continued to have major concerns with the APR and the BPR. I'd like the government to think again when it comes to whisky duty. And I would also like the government to think again when it comes to the level of transparency and scrutiny that's able to be provided throughout the course of the finance bill. This is not the first time I'm asking this. In fact, members are probably sick of me asking for oral evidence sessions to be included in the finance bill, but I will keep asking until it happens. So if you want to stop me having this conversation, just make it happen and we'll be completely grand. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Phil Brickell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to refer to new Clause 4 in particular and to the wider issue of tax dodging and enforcement in this country. And I make these remarks as Chair of the APPG on anti-corruption and responsible tax. Now, let me begin by congratulating the Government on the action it has already taken to tackle tax avoidance and evasion. The measures brought forward by the Chancellor and the Treasury team to strengthen HMRC's powers, to invest in enforcement and to crack down on abusive tax schemes do represent an important step in restoring fairness to the system. They have sent a clear signal that in Britain, the rules should be the same for everyone. The same rules for the multinational company and the market trader. The same rules for the billionaire and the builder. And the same rules for those with the most expensive accountants as for those who simply pay what they owe. More broadly, I also welcome the government's wider economic plan, which, despite global headwinds outside the Chancellor's gift, is beginning to restore stability after years of uncertainty and drift. And after 14 years in which economic instability and mortgage-spiking kamikaze budgets became the norm, restoring stability is no small achievement. It is the foundation on which everything else must be built. Investment, growth and confidence that the system is working in the interests of ordinary working people. Now, turning to Clause 4. As a financial crime compliance officer in a previous life, where I spent many years dealing with the practical realities of financial crime controls, anti-money laundering systems and tax compliance, I recognise the principle my friend, the member for Walthamstow, is pursuing around cracking down on the enablers of crackpot tax avoidance schemes. We've all seen the rise of so-called finfluencers promoting dubious arrangements online. Schemes dress up as clever financial advice, but which in reality promise something that should always ring alarm bells. Something for nothing. And I make no judgment on the merits of the specific new clause, so I would welcome further discussion with the member for Walthamstow on her amendment after the debate today. But my sincere hope is that HMRC is already fully alert to the risks posed by these schemes and is monitoring the promotion of them closely. I hope the Minister will be able to comment on this during the wind-ups. But my honourable friend has hit the nail on the head when it comes to a fundamental issue in the country, that aggressive tax avoidance and tax evasion have, in many ways, become decriminalised, not through any change in the law, but through something far more corrosive, a lack of enforcement. Laws can exist on the statute book, offences can be created, powers can be granted, but if they're not used, if they're not enforced, if those who break those rules rarely face consequences, then the signal that is sent is unmistakable. And I'm afraid to say that much of this decline occurred on the watch of the party opposite. Because for 14 long years, we saw enforcement weaken, we saw complexity increase, and we saw a culture in which some individuals and firms appeared to believe that paying tax was optional, so long as they could afford sufficiently inventive advice. At the same time, the Conservatives drove the tax burden to the highest level in 80 years, while turning a blind eye to those who simply refused to pay it. And in response to an intervention earlier from the member for Bridgwater, who unfortunately is not in his place, it was the Conservative government in 2023 that scrapped the Office for Tax Simplification. And now the official opposition have the sheer audacity to talk about making £47 billion of cuts, the equivalent of firing every police officer in Britain twice over. It's simply not credible. Now, members may recall my speech on the 27th of November last year during the budget debate. For those who don't remember, in my remarks then, I referenced one of the more surreal examples of tax avoidance that has surfaced in recent years: the elaborate mollusk-based wheezes used to avoid business rates. Schemes so convoluted that they led one high-profile individual to acquire more knowledge than anyone should ever reasonably possess about snail fornication, snail gestation, snail feed, and rather disturbingly, snail cannibalism. You really couldn't make it up. Slimy advisors, snail farms and shell companies, all deployed in the service of dodging a lawful tax bill. It sounds absurd, and in many ways it really is, because it also illustrates something deeper and more troubling, because the creativity deployed in designing these schemes, the ingenuity, the complexity, the sheer effort involved is often directed not towards creating wealth or innovation, but towards avoiding a basic civic responsibility. That's why I welcome section 156 of this bill, which prohibits the promotion of tax avoidance arrangements with civil penalties and criminal offences built into the bill to tackle the unlawful promotion of such initiatives. Now, on enforcement, the Bureau of Investigative Journalism has highlighted just how far things have fallen in recent years. Prosecutions against tax enablers dropped by around 75% between 2018 and 2024. HMRC has not found a single enabler of offshore tax evasion or non-compliance in 5 years. And that is a dramatic decline that sends the wrong signal. And it also risks creating the impression that while most people must play by the rules, those with the right advisors can simply play around them. In fact, after we got a new corporate criminal offence of failure to prevent the facilitation of tax evasion in the 2017 Criminal Finances Act, we've seen very little enforcement. And when prosecutions are rare, deterrence weakens. When enforcement is inconsistent, compliance declines. And when those who break the rules see others doing so without consequence, the entire system begins to fray. So I welcome the steps the government has already taken to strengthen enforcement against dishonest tax advisors by introducing new penalties, with some £1.7 billion committed to strengthen the work of Revenue and Customs. However, might I gently suggest to the Minister that he could be going yet a little further? As he begins thinking about the next budget, I would like to point him towards some literature I hope he will find useful. The APPGI chair produced a report entitled Clean Foundations for Growth. I have a copy for here if he has lost his, but there's plenty in there. I'll just highlight two asks relevant to new clause 4 that was discussed slightly earlier. 1, tax advisors and accountants should also be signed up as members of a professional body. 2, professionals whose membership has been revoked for tax fraud should no longer be able to operate. And that's because those who design or enable abuse of the system should not simply be able to reinvent themselves under a new letterhead and continue as before. And economic success can't be just measured in national statistics. In the towns of Bolton, Blackrod, Horwich and Westwharton, my constituents want to see fairness in the tax system and real change on their high streets. They want to know that hard work is rewarded, that playing by the rules is not a disadvantage, and they want to know that those who cheat the system will not prosper at the expense of those who comply. Indeed, many legitimate businesses in my constituency work incredibly hard and quite rightly pay their taxes properly, yet they are often systematically undercut by suspicious, cash-intensive businesses which appear to ignore the rules. And in In some areas, residents see rows of shops that rarely seem busy, but somehow continue operating year after year. It undermines legitimate traders and corrodes confidence, all at a time when the UK's tax gap remains at a stubbornly high £40-odd billion. That's tens of billions of pounds that should be collected each year, which simply isn't. That's tens of billions of pounds that could fund schools, hospitals and our policing. Tens of billions of pounds that, when uncollected, shift the burden onto those who do not play by the rules. And that's why I welcome the Chancellor's announcement of the High Street Illegality Task Force in last year's budget. First, we must recognise high street tax evasion as a systemic issue, not just as a series of isolated cases. Weaknesses in company identification and verification at Companies House, gaps in licensing frameworks and opaque property ownership structures allow non-compliant businesses to repeatedly reappear. Second, we should strengthen corporate accountability by increasing penalties for landlords and letting agents who knowingly enable tax abuse or repeated non-payment of business rates within their properties. Third, the government should consider stronger licensing regimes for certain cash-intensive sectors, moving from voluntary to mandatory licensing in areas such as barbering and hairdressing would help ensure that persistently non-compliant operators can be identified and, where necessary, shut down. We only need to look at the Dutch BIBOB Act to see how effective a proportionate but properly functioning licensing regime can be in driving out bad businesses and regenerating local economies. Fourth, we need greater transparency around commercial property ownership so that authorities can more easily identify repeat problem addresses and Phoenix companies that reopen under new names. Fifth, the task force should examine the role of landlords and managing agents because too often properties are repeatedly let to businesses that fail to pay tax or business rates. Landlords must have both the responsibility and the tools to remove tenants engaged in illegal activity. Now, we've heard a little bit about Gibraltar in the context of gambling taxation during the course of our debate today, from the members for Hales-Owen and my honourable friend, the member for Stoke-on-Trent Central, both in reference to new Clause 9. The Minister knows how strongly I feel about tax avoidance and evasion involving the UK's overseas territories. The United Kingdom has long been regarded as a global leader in corporate transparency. In 2016, it became the first G20 country to establish a public register of company ownership, including now in Gibraltar, where actually there has not been a noticeable impact on Gibraltar's economy. However, a series of major leaks, the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers, and the Pandora Papers have revealed the shameful role played by parts of the UK's offshore network in enabling evasion of taxes and the laundering of ill-gotten gains. The British Virgin Islands alone accounts for more than half of the shell companies exposed in the Panama Papers, and companies registered there have appeared in about 90% of the major corruption cases identified by Transparency International over the past 2 decades, involving an estimated £250 billion diverted through rigged procurement, bribery, embezzlement and the unlawful seizure of state assets. High-profile examples of tax dodging illustrate that the system is simply not working as it should, and I welcome any measures that the government will take following today's bill to address that issue. Now, to wind up, against this backdrop, the government distributes significant amounts in tax reliefs, £204 billion in 22-23 alone. Now, they can be important mechanisms to promote innovation and growth, but the 107 non-structural reliefs we have ended up with have received relatively little scrutiny. I've mentioned this in the House previously, and in some cases, those reliefs have not even been costed properly by HMRC. So I'd welcome any comments the Minister can give on that point. In summary, my constituents in Bolton West simply want to know that the rules apply to everyone. They want a tax system that's fair, they want high streets where legitimate businesses can thrive, they want confidence that those who cheat the system will not be allowed to prosper. If the High Street Illegality Task Force focuses on enforcement and practical reforms, it has the potential to restore confidence, support honest traders and ensure that everyone pays their fair share. And I look forward to doing all I can to support the Chancellor, the Treasury team and HMRC in this endeavour, and I trust this bill will be one measure that works towards achieving that end goal.
Jim Allister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I rise to speak to Amendments 112 to 139 in my name and that of other honourable colleagues. When the Chancellor introduced the budget. She described it as a budget for growth, a budget to encourage business. The natural assumption would be that growth would be for the whole United Kingdom, that there would be no discrimination against any part of this United Kingdom, and what was available to encourage growth in one part of the UK would be available in the other. That would be a natural expectation from being a United Kingdom. But sadly, this bill does not live up to that expectation, because clauses 13, 14 and 15 introduced quite scandalous discrimination against businesses in Northern Ireland. Clauses 13 to 15 are about uplifting the assistance that can be available to business, updating it from when it last was updated for England, for Scotland, for Wales, but not if your business is in Northern Ireland. And these are the very levers that enable business to grow. Clause 13 is about enterprise management incentives. Enterprise management incentives were introduced in 2000. And since then, thousands of companies have used them as a tool to attract, retain and reward their employees through options, enabling their employees to acquire shares in their company without a liability to income tax or national insurance contributions. Instead, the gain is usually subject to lower rates of tax under capital gains. There have been, under the enterprise management incentive, of course, thresholds, caps as to what is available. In this budget bill, under clause 13, the EMI limit on company options will be increased to £6 million for Scotland, for England, for Wales, but it will stay at £3 million for Northern Ireland. The EMI limit on gross assets will be increased to £120 million in England, Scotland and Wales, but limited to just £30 million in Northern Ireland. In England, Scotland and Wales, the number of employees you can have lifted to 500. In Northern Ireland, retained at 250. So on that measure, and it is one of a trio of measures which are capable of encouraging businesses to grow, we are going to see an uplift for Great Britain, but stagnation in terms of the assistance in Northern Ireland. We see the same in clause 14 under the Enterprise Investment Scheme. The Enterprise Investment Scheme, along with the Venture Capital Trust, which is covered in clause 15, has been a very useful tool in terms of companies attracting in investment so that they can grow. It has been described by the British Business Bank as a government-driven initiative designed to stimulate investment in early-stage businesses through venture capital. It serves as a significant source of capital for those companies while also providing attractive tax reliefs to the investors who support them. So what's happening to the Enterprise Investment Scheme across this one United Kingdom? Well, in England, Scotland and Wales, The gross asset requirements will be raised to 30 million. In Northern Ireland, it stays at 15 million. For standard companies, for new growth companies, an uplift for both in GB, but none in Northern Ireland. While a knowledge-intensive company's lifetime investment limit in Scotland, England and Wales will be raised to 40 million, in Northern Ireland it is capped at 20 million. And the same when it comes to Clause 15 and the venture capital trust. Again, Northern Ireland is trapped at the level set in 2012, whereas the rest of the country is allowed to move into 2026. So when this government talks about growth, when this government pretends that it's growth for the whole United Kingdom, then the fundamental question I have to ask is, why is this a budget in clauses 13, 14 and 15 that inhibits growth in my part of the United Kingdom, does not give a level playing field, does not allow equality across the United Kingdom, denies parity to Northern Ireland in this way? This amounts to systemic discrimination against business in my constituency. One is tempted to ask, is the government trying to incentivise companies to cape to GB? Is that the motivation? Because if you were about to set up a company and you realised that your venture capital thresholds were higher in GB, the incentives that you could be given are higher in GB, why would you go to Northern Ireland? And that is the disparity that this government is creating. And it's certainly not because the private sector is doing too well in Northern Ireland, because Northern Ireland still, alas, has 27% of its workforce in the public sector in comparison with the UK average of 18. The answer sadly lies in the fact that this government and this Parliament embraces this discrimination against Northern Ireland because it is wholly beholden to the European Union. Because Northern Ireland, under the iniquitous Windsor framework, has been left under the EU state aid rules of the EU. That's the effect of Article 10 of the Windsor framework. It leaves us subject to the state aid rules of other foreign institutions, not the state aid rules of this United Kingdom. And that has caused this government, in its beholden attitude to the EU, to simply, when it comes to these enterprise schemes, when it comes to the venture capital, when it comes to all these things in clauses 13 to 15, to retain Northern Ireland at the levels of support that were permitted pre-Brexit. Why? Because it is not prepared to face down the EU on the imposition of their foreign laws on this party, on my party, United Kingdom, in respect of support for industry. Yes, I give way.
Thank you, Honourable Member, for giving way. There are many SME businesses in my constituency looking to expand and invest and grow beyond SME, but this bill does not afford them that opportunity. You would forgive businesses in Northern Ireland for feeling deeply disadvantaged. This, on top of the practical daily problems they face as a result of the Windsor framework, is putting them at a disadvantage.
There's absolutely no doubt about that. And the government is putting it up in lights. They are saying to new businesses coming in to the United Kingdom or starting in the United Kingdom, if you place yourself in GB, you will have an uplift which is available to you in terms of the aid we can give, in terms of the venture capital you can draw in. But if you stay in Northern Ireland, then you'll be at the bottom of the pile, treated unequally.
Would my honourable friend give way?
Certainly will.
Thank you. Could you remind me what the growth rate in Northern Ireland was last year for 12 months? Sorry, could the honourable member please remind me what the growth rate in Northern Ireland was for the year to 23rd, whatever, compared to what it was in the UK? I think it might be 3 times higher. 3 times higher, 3 times higher.
I can tell the honourable member, and it's a very insightful question. But the answer is even more insightful, because the growth that we've had in Northern Ireland is in the services sector. Lo and behold, the sector that's outside the Windsor framework, the manufacturing sector, which is clobbered by the Windsor framework, has not grown. The growth that we've had, and thank goodness for it, is the growth in the services sector. And that is an illustration, contrary to the honourable gentleman's mantra of believing that all things EU are precious and beneficial. That is an indication that our liberation from the EU in terms of services has served us well, but our entrapment in the EU in respect of manufacturing has served us very ill. And what this bill is doing is underwriting that disadvantage to Northern Ireland. And I say to the Minister, tell my constituents, tell my businesses why they are treated differently, why they are less deserving of the same capacity to be supported, why they cannot draw in the same level of venture capital or these investment schemes. Why are they the second-class citizens of this United Kingdom? Of course, the answer, as I've said, is because this government is wholly beholden to the EU. But of course, this is a government now with a reset policy. And if it follows the trends of Northern Ireland, then very shortly, under its reset policy, touching upon the matters that are going to be in it, they're going to enslave themselves again to EU state aid rules. They're going to end up in the same predicament, where they will not be allowed to increase their state aid such as they're doing here. And one final point the House needs to understand, that if there is a dispute about whether or not there has been state aid that might breach the rules of our foreign masters, and it's not the courts of this land that decide that. It's the European Court of Justice that decides that. And that is why it is so obnoxious, so wrong, so offensive, that though I sit as a member for a United Kingdom constituency in this Parliament of the United Kingdom, I come here representing an area which cannot make the laws. This Parliament cannot make the laws that govern these issues in Northern Ireland because of the surrender of sovereignty to the EU. And if this government had any backbone, if it cared about parity in the United Kingdom, if it cared about the businesses in my constituency, then it would be setting about giving us an equal playing field and facing down those who insist that it's their laws, not our laws, which must apply.
Minister to wind up.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and may I thank all members for their contributions in this stage of the passage of the bill. We're almost there. I would like to take some time to respond directly to the amendments that have been discussed today by members on all sides of the House. To start with, Madam Chair, I would like to address the amendments 1 to 4 and 5 and 7 together. These were raised by the Shadow Exchequer Secretary in his speech. Amendments 1 to 4 would remove the increase in dividend, savings and property income tax rates. Amendment 5 would prevent income tax thresholds staying at their current levels until 2030. And Amendment 7 would remove reforms to the inheritance tax treatment on pensions. Based on costings that have been certified by the OBR, the direct impact of these amendments would cumulatively reduce forecast revenue raised in 2029-30, the year of relevance for our fiscal rules, by a whopping £12 billion. These amendments, therefore, pose a significant risk to the sustainability of our public finances and our ability to fund the NHS and the public services that we all rely on. I therefore urge the House to reject Amendment 1 to 4 and Amendments 5 and 7. I'll happily give way, though.
The Minister concede that actually if that was offset by £12 billion worth of welfare spending, there wouldn't be any threat to the sustainability of the finances.
If the party opposite had credible plans and had a credible history of reining in welfare spending, then of course I'd be interested to take them seriously. But the party's opposite shadow chancellor was the Work and Pensions Secretary when the welfare budget exploded. It's something we're now trying to get on top of. I won't address new clauses 15 to 19 directly today. The government set out its position on them at previous parliamentary stages of the bill, though I do urge the House to reject new clauses 15 to 19. Turning now to the points raised by the member for North Antrim in his speech around amendments 112 to 139 that would have the effect of removing the distinction between the options available in respect of specified Northern Ireland companies and other companies from clauses 13, 14 and 15. He's made his views known very clearly today and at second reading of the bill. I would make the same point that my honourable friend, the Economic Secretary, made at that stage of proceedings, and that is that services companies, as he is aware, but I don't believe did mention in his speech, are able to benefit from the increase in the thresholds, and it is the government's understanding that there are very few, if any, goods in the electricity companies in Northern Ireland that are close to the current enterprise management incentives limits, and we therefore think there will be minimal impact of these companies being subject to the previous scheme limits. So I therefore do urge, I will give way.
Mr. saying to the House that the criteria here is to look at each region and see who is near the thresholds, and then you magically increase those that are. Surely the truth is that the Minister is not increasing the thresholds because he's handed the power to do so to a foreign jurisdiction.
I'm just stating a fact here, which is that there are very few, if any, thresholds, businesses near the relevant thresholds. He made the point that, that the decision that the government has made may be hampering growth and investment, and I'm just responding, setting out that I do not think that to be the case. And I am proud to be a member of a government that is seeking to deepen and strengthen our ties with the European Union so that we can increase our productivity in this country through having better flowing trade and working together with our partners in the European Union. So I do urge the House to reject amendments 112 to 139. Madam Chair, turning to amendments that relate to the changes to business property relief and agricultural property relief, these were raised by the opposition spokesperson, the Shadow Exchequer Secretary, as well as the member for the Weald of Kent and Keighley and Ilkley. If we were to adopt these amendments, this would weaken the public purse by around £300 million a year. It would also leave a status quo which contributes to the very largest estates paying a lower average effective inheritance tax rates than the smallest estates, and therefore I do urge the House to reject amendments 6 and 8. If I may, the member for Keighley and Ilkley also asked for clarity on the point around payment deadlines within the inheritance tax system. It is the government's position that the 6-month point is the right one. It has applied for a long time, and it is not our position to change that timeline when these new changes come into force. Yes, I would give way.
For giving way, and I note that it's the government's position, but what level of assessment has the government done on the negative implications of just having a 6-month period as opposed to extending it to 18 months? Because from the level of engagement that this side of the House has done with many stakeholders is that the consequences are huge. What assessment has the government done on this specific issue?
This is, of course, an issue that was considered both, I'm sure, before the policy was initially announced, and it's something that I've considered too since I've been in post. And it is just worth pointing out that HMRC does already offer several payment options to help personal representatives to pay inheritance tax. This allows banks, building societies or investment providers to pay some or all of the inheritance tax due from the deceased person's accounts before probate is granted. And there are a range of ways that are available to people to enable them to be able to pay IHT within 6 months. I do urge the House to reject Amendment 88. Madam Chair, Amendments 89 to 94 would exclude the value of any joint interest in certain agricultural or business tenancies from the 2.5 million allowance. I will give.
I'm grateful to the Minister for giving way. Could he just tell us when he last met a farmer?
I thank my honourable friend for his question. The President of the National Farmers Union mentioned in his speech to the Farmers' Conference just a few weeks ago that he was glad of the engagement that I, as the Exchequer Secretary, have had with farmers. He personally called out that engagement, the trip that I did to the constituency of Hexham after being invited there by my honourable friend. I was glad to meet with farmers there and to learn about their experiences. Madam Chair, Amendments 89 to 94 seek to exclude the value of any joint interest in certain agricultural or business tenancies from the 2.5 million allowance for 100% relief. It is worth pointing out here, though, that the drafting of the amendments risks actually having these tenancies fall outside of the allowance entirely, which would mean that rather than providing 100% relief, the Government is concerned that the drafting would mean that for those with joint tenancies, the relief may well be capped at 50%. So that is certainly a reason to reject those amendments. I am going to make progress, if he'll forgive me, due to having spoken for 8 minutes already. Madam Chair, Amendments 102 to 107 mean unlimited 100% agricultural property relief would be available on agricultural land rented out for at least 10 years. The Government's position is that the House should reject these amendments. I know the member for Witney also raised a new clause 11, and here the Government has decided on a range of thresholds that they will continue to be frozen until the end of the decade. That is a decision that we've made across the piece. It was mentioned earlier in the debate in order to sustainably and fairly raise revenue to fund our public services and to get borrowing down. I therefore urge the House to reject Amendments 102 to 107. I will not address in detail new clauses 12 or Amendments 67 to 87, 95 to 100 and 108 to 111. As the Government has set out its position on these amendments at previous stages of the bill, I do urge the House to reject them. The member for Stoke-on-Trent Central and the member for Hales Owen both made important contributions on the gambling duties related amendments. I have met twice with the Minister who he mentioned from Gibraltar, and I have been in correspondence with him. I do understand there are significant impacts on the economy in Gibraltar, and that is something that I hope to keep engaging and discussing. I will.
Thank you. Whilst the Minister's at the dispatch box, because I'm glad he's meeting, is he able to give an assurance that there are no future surprises and no significant tax changes that plan to be announced that will disproportionately affect areas like Gibraltar because of the dependence they have on certain industries?
We will, of course, continue to engage with ministers in Gibraltar. It wouldn't be appropriate for me at this dispatch box today to write future budgets, but we have made a significant change when it comes to gambling taxation, and rather than make further changes, the Government will, of course, monitor to see the impact of that change. I thank the member for Hales Owen for his contributions and for his representations to me. The member for Aberdeen North made a helpful speech with not much notice, I understand. She raised alcohol duty. It's worth pointing out that the uprating in alcohol duty just keeps the revenue in line with inflation. We have seen reductions in alcohol consumption, driven not by the tax staying in line with inflation, but more due to changes in consumers' consumption habits. I therefore urge that the House reject Amendment 101 and new Clause 20. Okay.
Minister, he's overcome his natural reluctance, and I'm grateful to him. A lot of people get confused around the BPR tax changes, and if there was 10 million, for instance, in a company that was inherited by someone that was subject to these changes, that they would only have to pay 2 million in tax, whereas in fact that money has to first be extracted from the company in order to pay that tax. So the person who inherits it rather than the company pays it. Could the Minister confirm that? So if they took it out in the form of dividends, instead of 2 million, it would be 3.3 million. And that would have a very real impact on a small company. In fact, could be existential.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm not going to get into specific worked examples, but the general point that the government has made changes both to business property relief and to agricultural property relief in order to be able to raise additional revenue from the very wealthiest estates is something that this government has sought to do because we want to put fairness into our tax system. On the topic of the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, this was mentioned both by the opposition but also for my honourable friend, the member for Mid and South Pembrokeshire. I really want to thank him for his strong advocacy for his constituency, the 1,000 people who live and work in his constituency at the refinery there. The government at the budget said that we recognise the importance that refineries play in our energy security, and we are now considering the feasibility and impacts of including refined products in the CBAM in the future. This is very complicated and it does have knock-on impacts on other sectors if the government were to proceed with it. I have met with the sector recently and I'll continue to engage with them. May I just finally turn to new Clause 4, which requires the Chancellor to report on how the regulations within the prohibition addresses the harm to individuals and businesses from online tax avoidance promotion and the steps HMRC should take to inform the public of the risk posed by online tax avoidance. I want to thank my honourable friend, the member for Walthamstow, for raising this important aspect around avoidance promotion. I agree with her that it is appalling that these individuals promote tax avoidance schemes and are able to get away with it. It causes misery to those caught up in the schemes and depriving our public services of vital revenue. The government is taking action via this finance bill to crack down on them. I would like to confirm to the House that the measure introduced in clauses 156 to 162 apply equally to those promoting avoidance schemes online, including on social media, and to those promoting through more traditional routes. I can also confirm that the promoter action notice clauses in 163 to 173 will also apply. I would also like to reassure my honourable friend that we are publishing guidance on these matters, and I will ensure that the government's intention is clear throughout them to capture anyone who is promoting tax avoidance. This includes social media influencers who are promoting tax avoidance and making a monetary gain through clicks, as highlighted by my honourable friend, and I would welcome her engagement on developing this guidance.
I thank the Minister for giving way, and can I thank all the MPs across the House, except in the obvious party, that understand the risk to our constituents from this advice. May I just ask the Minister, it's very, very welcome to see a government so quickly respond to social media problems, unlike the last one with the payday lending and buy now, pay later lenders. He talks about issuing guidance. Does he have a rough timeline for when that guidance will be available? I guess what I'm really asking on behalf of the millions of people these ripped off, when will Samuel Leeds get a knock at the door from the taxman?
I look forward to working with her and other members who are interested in this topic to make sure we can move as quickly as we possibly can. Let me thank all members for their contributions during this debate, and I shall conclude there.
The question is that new Clause 5 be read a second time. As many as of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The question is that new Clause 5 be added to the bill. As many as of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We come to Government New Clause 6. I call the Minister to move New Clause 6 formally.
Formally.
Offshore income gains savings.
The question is that new clause 6 be read a second time. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The question is that new clause 6 be added to the bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We come to Government New Clause 7. I call the Minister to move New Clause 7 formally.
Formally.
Pensions abolition of the lifetime allowance charge.
The question is that new clause 7 be read a second time. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The question is that new clause 7 be added to the bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. New clause 4 has been selected for separate decision. I call Stella Creasy to move new clause 4 formally.
No need, it's withdrawn.
Not moved. New clause 11 has been selected for separate decision. I call the Liberal Democrat spokesperson to move new clause 11 formally.
Move formally.
Uprating of allowance amounts for agricultural property.
The question is that new clause 11 be read a second time. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No! Division! Clear the lobby. The question is that new clause 11 be read a second time. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No! The tellers for the ayes are Bobby Dean and Charlotte Kane. The tellers for the noes, Gregor Poynton and Deirdre Costigan. Order.
The ayes to the right, 174. The noes to the left, 292.
The ayes to the right were 174. The noes to the left, 292. So the noes have it. The noes have it. Unlock. Order. Order. Under the order of the House of the 16th of December 2025, I must now put the questions necessary to bring proceedings on consideration to a conclusion. Amendment 5 has been selected for separate decision. I call the opposition spokesperson to move the amendment formally.
Move formally.
The question is that Amendment 5 be made. As many as of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Of the contrary, no. No. Division. Clear the lobby. The question is that Amendment 5 be made. As many as of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Of the contrary, no. No. The tellers for the ayes are Lincoln Jopp and Andrew Snowden. The tellers for the noes, Deirdre Costigan and Gregor Poynton. Order, order.
The ayes to the right, 172. The noes to the left, 283.
The ayes to the right were 172. The noes to the left, 283. So the noes have it. The noes have it. Unlock. I call the Minister to move Government Amendments 12 to 14 formally.
Formally.
The question is that Government Amendments 12 to 14 be made. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Amendment 6 has been selected for separate decision. I call the opposition spokesperson to move the amendment formally.
I beg to move.
The question is that Amendment 6 be made. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. Clear the lobby. The question is that Amendment 6 be made. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. The tellers for the ayes are Lincoln Jopp and Andrew Snowden. The tellers for the noes, Deirdre Costigan and Gregor Poynton. Order, order.
The ayes to the right, 175. The noes to the left, 292.
The ayes to the right were 175, the noes to the left 292, so the noes have it, the noes have it. Unlock. I call the Minister to move Government Amendments 15 to 53, 56 to 61, 54, 55 and 62 to 66 formally.
Formally.
The question is that Government Amendments 15 to 53, 56 to 61, 54, 55 and 62 to 66 be made. As many as are of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Consideration completed. Third reading.
Now.
I call the Minister to move third reading. Lucy Rigby.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I beg to move that the bill be read for a third time. The budget in November was a budget to build a stronger, more secure economy. It contained fair and necessary choices to deliver the public's priorities by cutting the cost of living, cutting debt and borrowing, cutting child poverty and cutting NHS waiting lists. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, the budget had at its heart three deliberate pro-growth choices. First, by choosing to maintain economic stability, getting inflation and interest rates down, we gave businesses the confidence to invest and our economy the room to grow. And second, by choosing to reject austerity, we protected over £120 billion of additional investment in growth-driving infrastructure. And third, by choosing to back the fast-growing British companies of the future, we supported the investment, the innovation and the economic dynamism that will increase growth, raise living standards, boost this country's prosperity in the next decade and beyond. The measures in this bill deliver on those choices by introducing tax levers to unlock investment, to back our wealth creators and to attract talent. By sticking to commitments in the corporate tax roadmap to provide certainty to businesses and by doubling the limits for our enterprise tax incentives so scale-ups can attract capital and talent that they need to grow. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, the bill also contains a series of other responsible choices on tax. And that is because at budget the government faced a choice. We could have made the reckless choice to abandon our fiscal rules and let borrowing and debt increase. But instead, we made the pro-growth choice to get borrowing, debt and inflation down, more than doubling our headroom. We could have made the irresponsible choice and returned to austerity, cutting public services, as the party opposite did, and undermining capital investment. But instead, we made the pro-growth choice to protect the investment in Britain's infrastructure and to build a better, stronger, more secure economy. And in line with our commitment to fiscal responsibility, Madam Deputy Speaker, this bill maintains income tax thresholds for employees and the self-employed at current levels for a further 3 years, from April 2028 to April 2031. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, this bill also contains measures to strengthen the integrity of the tax system by closing loopholes and removing barriers. So that includes reforms to collect more unpaid taxes and to modernise the tax system to make it easier for taxpayers to get their tax right first time. We're introducing new powers to close in on promoters of marketed tax avoidance and to challenge those who knowingly engage fraudulent business within the construction industry. So alongside the measures announced at Budget 2024, the measures in this bill to close the tax gap bring the total revenue from tax gap measures announced this Parliament to £10 billion in 2029 to 30. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, I would like to thank wholeheartedly all members and right honourable members right across this House for their contributions to the debates during the bill's passage. The measures, Madam Deputy Speaker, in this bill contain the right choices for the public finances, the right choices on investment, the right choices for businesses and for working people, the right choices for our public services and the right choices for Britain. And for these reasons, I commend this bill to the House.
The question is that the bill be now read the third time. Shadow Minister James Weald.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I join the Minister in thanking honourable members on all sides of the House who joined in the debate, and there's rather more of them here than there have been throughout those proceedings. And I also thank the parliamentary staff and honourable members who chaired the committee. In this 534-page finance bill, the government has chosen to impose a raft of tax-rising measures that hit work, enterprise and investment and add significantly to the regulatory costs on UK businesses. They have extended the freeze on income tax thresholds, dragging hundreds of thousands of more working people into higher tax bands. They've introduced a family farm and family business tax, targeting rural communities and family firms. And they have increased taxes on savings, property income and long-term investment. Taken together, these measures amount to billions of extra taxation, pushing the overall tax burden to ever-record levels. Ultimately, the Chancellor, in her decisions, has chosen to make the UK a less attractive place for businesses and for the investors that we need to grow the economy. Just last week, the OBR cut growth projections again. At a time of global uncertainty, the government is taking the wrong course. And it shows. Unemployment is up, taxes are up, welfare spending is going up, and living standards will slow over the course of this Parliament. This government has led the country into a high-tax, low-growth doom loop. Now, there's a long list of voices sounding the alarm over the economy, but the Chancellor is still not listening. Rather than change course, she is sticking to her failing plan of higher taxes, higher spending and borrowing. This is a bill that breaks the promises to the British people, and we will be opposing it this evening.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Charlie Maynard.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Speaking on behalf of Liberal Democrats, I think about high tax, low growth doom loop, and the audacity of that is pretty high. I would like to ask the government to look again at 4 things with regard to this bill, and I'm going to go through them quickly and then I'll sit down. Provide more detail quickly on its plans to prevent pensioners from being dragged into paying income tax. Publish information on how the freezing of tax thresholds to 2030-2031 impacts households at various income levels. Recognise the impact its policies are having on youth unemployment, 100,000 up in the last year, and take steps to halt this rapid rise. At a minimum, this would include reducing the national insurance contributions rate paid by employers on part-time employees earning between £5,000 and £9,100 per year. And finally, as per new clause, which we just pushed to the vote, the government needs to still take again and look again at a fairer approach to farmers by allowing the thresholds on APR to rise over time in line with agricultural land prices rather than having those threshold values eroded over time. Thank you.
The question is that the bill be now read the third time. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. The question is that the bill be now read the third time. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. of the contrary, no.
No!
The tellers for the ayes are Deirdre Costigan and Gregor Poynton. The tellers for the noes, Lincoln Jopp and Andrew Snowden. Order, order.
The ayes to the right, 292. The noes to the left, 161.
The ayes to the right were 292. The noes to the left, 161. So the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Unlock. Before we move on to the next business, and unfortunately the Government Chief Whip has left the Chamber, can I just emphasise to all members the need to vote in a prompt manner. There can be no excuse for loitering in the lobby.
Noted.